blasting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings to all of you from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, the planetary capital of sun, fun, sin, sex, and secrets, my not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves, and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophonous cavalcade of conversation. I don't think we have to work too hard to promote the program tonight or slip a few hints about what's to come as kind of teasers. If you're a regular listener to Coast, you know what's coming. No guest has generated as much interest and anticipation as David Paulides does. He first unveiled his Missing 411 project with me on Coast some years ago. If you've heard any of those previous interviews, you know it's a gripping subject, baffling, perplexing, and more than a bit spooky. And you know that Dave always does his homework. He's been gracious enough to unveil each new book of the series on the nights when I've hosted, and these are the kind of shows where nobody goes to sleep early. Most people don't go to sleep at all after hearing these stories about mysterious disappearances. The focus, of course, as we know, started in national parks, then expanded to national forests, then expanded further, often concentrated in clusters, specific clusters. The cases discussed in the books are carefully screened to meet certain criteria, and the facts and circumstances which would rule out obvious explanations. People getting just lost or killed by predators, dying of natural causes out there in the wilderness. Tonight, the latest chapter. And instead of casting sort of a wide possible net, Dave has narrowed his focus to a specific set of victims, if you will. People who share common characteristics. Tonight, the focus is on hunters. And I think that's especially chilling, given that hunters are often our best and most experienced outdoorsmen or outdoors people. People who know the woods, they know the mountains best. They're the most comfortable out there. They're better equipped than, say, a day hiker or even a casual camper out for a weekend with the family. They're not only well equipped, they're armed. So whatever is preying on them, whatever is killing them, whatever is taking them away to wherever is apparently not deterred by guns and bullets or bows and arrows or knives. I think by the end of tonight, we might have a better idea of what's going on, what Dave Paulides thinks of it himself, which, as you know, he's always been careful to avoid committing to any particular answer. I think for a long time it's because he wasn't really sure what that answer is. But now you know what's coming tonight. The new book is called Missing 411 Hunters, Unexplained Disappearances, and it's chock full of new cases. Almost 150 of them, covering 4 different countries. And I'm telling you, they're flat out weird. Dave will be with us for 3 hours tonight, and I promise I'll carve out some time so you can ask a few questions. And then in hour 4, still trying to work this out, his son Ben directed the documentary film. You might recall, some of you listeners probably were involved in the crowdsource funding of that project. I got a look at it a couple of weeks ago. It's chilling and fantastic, and Ben is the guy who directed it. Trying to line it up so maybe he can join us in hour 4 tonight and talk about the film a little bit. I do hope that you will take the time to visit the Coast to Coast website, where you can find links to Dave Paulides' work on tonight's page. Also there, Knapp's News. It's the eclectic little collection of oddities and items accumulated by webmaster Lex and I, culled from various news and information sources. Among the stories tonight, something that fits the mood. A story about death and other mysteries at a spooky lake in New York. Also a story about how scientists are bringing people back from the dead, some amazing medical work being done. A TV piece that I put together this past week about NASA's underwater laboratory. You ever heard of this place? It's Aquarius, it's called, off the coast of Key Largo, underwater. They got teams of astronauts, or maybe we call them aquanauts, under the Atlantic Ocean, learning skills that will help them eventually in space. Also, a physician who was along on the mission this last 8 days or so. We got to interview him, working on some technology that's right out of Star Trek. And Also, a story about DNA tests that show maybe there is an unknown species of human out there, something we were unaware of previously. That'll get the juices flowing. Those stories and more in Knapp's News on the Coast website. While you're there, check out how to become a Coast Insider. Cost about 15 cents a day, giving you access to a vast archive of programs, the current stuff, classic stuff, and you can check out George Norrie's TV show, Beyond Belief, also available by prescription. So let's get ready to rumble, folks. The dog and the cat should already be inside the house where it's safe because, we don't know what's lurking outside there. Maybe slide the deadbolt for tonight. Put on a pot of coffee or maybe a nip of something stronger. This might even be a popcorn night. Slip into those silky jammies, plop down into that easy chair, turn down the lights and turn up the radio because here we go. Dave Paulides, Missing 411 Hunters. Coming up, I'm George Knapp, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Hardly a day goes by when I don't get emails or messages about the Missing 411 subject. People have their own theories, their own explanations, or incidents they want to ask about, or questions about the methodology that is used, all kinds of stuff. Dave Paulides is gracious enough to keep me in the loop between projects, between visits here to the program. In addition to the new book about hunters vanishing, there's a film project that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that many of you may have contributed to. We've talked about it a few times here. It's an interesting point, and Ben Paulides is the guy who directed it, and he'll be joining us in hour 4 to talk about where things stand. Dave Paulides, as many of you know, has a 20-year background in law enforcement and technology. His new book is the 6th in this series, and each one seems to creep us out more than the previous one. Welcome back to the program, Dave.
Hey, thanks a lot, George.
Let's talk a little bit about hunters in general. I mentioned in the first segment about sort of your narrow casting a bit in your earlier works. You cast a very wide net, gathering cases that sort of fit the criteria. Now in this book, you kind of focus down on a specific population, and it's creepier than the other stuff because of the skills that these particular folks have, or am I overstating it?
No, I think that's a dead on. When in the earlier books we talked about kids that were walking the trail with their parents and disappeared, and your mind can logically say, well, they're small kids, they're walking with their parents, they weren't paying attention, maybe they walked off. And sometimes people walking alone on the trail, they'll go out alone a lot, they maybe get lost and they're off the trail. But deer hunters, bear hunters, those people are attuned to being in the woods. They know exactly where they're going to go out and hunt. They know the terrain. They know the dangers. They carry weapons with them that are there to preclude them from being injured by other mammals. A lot of times they carry walkie-talkies with them so they can talk with their partners. Many times they'll carry a GPS trail guide and maps to ensure that they're going to the right spot. A lot of these guys that I've written about and women have gone to the same spot for decades to hunt. So they know that area like you know your backyard.
It's really like saying if it can happen to them, it can happen to anyone.
In many of the instances in this book, you read it, and I kept reading more and more details about it because it just became more and more confusing about how it could even happen. And I think that if you shoved one of these cases in front of the public, they'd say, oh, it's pretty obvious this person was murdered, and, it's a crime, and it's obvious homicide, but there's just no suspects. But when you look at tens of them or dozens of them, you start to say, wow, how can this even be?
Let's talk for a second before we jump into the cases about the kind of emails that you get. You must get them. I get them here and there, and it's not even my books. People who want to give you the explanation or people who want to give you information. I'll bet you get search and rescue people who are either they get ticked off because maybe they think you're slighting their work, or maybe they want to give you off the record information. Talk about that for a second.
So let's start with search and rescue people. First of all, they are the life's blood of search and rescue. 90 to 95% of all the people searching in the woods are volunteers. They're people that have gone out on their own time with their own money to get certified to search. It's not sheriff's deputies and rangers 95% of the time that are searching. They're volunteers. They're just people from the community that are going out and doing it, and they do a fantastic job. And one of my books, I dedicated to them. I've spoken in front of their groups before. They are great, great people. But they're searching and they're looking to rescue somebody. They aren't thinking criminal intent. They aren't thinking something unusual is happening. They just want to find you, make sure you're okay, and get you back to safety. So those people are absolutely the best, and without them, we'd be a lost. 90% of the people would never be found because there's not enough professional people in law enforcement to go out there and look. Now, as far as the emails, this is kind of a frustrating part because there's people out there that'll listen to a couple of our interviews, maybe watch a few YouTubes, and they'll write to me and they'll say, "Oh, I know what's doing this." And I get the same sort of email hundreds of times over a 6-month period from different
mountain
people.
lions.
Well, it's mountain lions. It's I've heard just lately. It's people growing marijuana, but people don't think about it and say, well, if there was a marijuana grow up going on out there, the last thing those people want to do is to bring any awareness to that area and bring searchers in because they'd find the marijuana grow. And in none of the cases I've ever written about has there been a marijuana grow found and people suspected in that grow of doing anything. It just doesn't happen. But I get a lot of them that people say, oh, I know what it is. It's one of the multitude of unusual paranormal things out there, and I get this. But what they forget is what we talk about on your show are maybe the top 5 or 10% of the cases in the book. And we don't go into detail into the graphs and the tables that I've written. And by now there's over 2,000 pages of documents. There's probably close to 1,800 cases. There's a geographical cluster map with 59 geographical clusters of missing people in North America. All of this leads to a very perplexing situation. And I say this on Facebook and on the other social sites. I have yet to find anybody that has read all of the books that has a cogent idea about what is happening. Now, the people that just listen to the interviews, a lot of people I get this from. But when you look and you lay out all of the facts from the different scenarios that all have linkage to one another, there's not one thing that really fits into that mold.
Let's do, just in case there are people there who have not heard the previous programs or haven't read the book, or it's been a while since they've been exposed to the material, maybe go over some of the profile points, the system that you use to sort of weed out explainable cases, because you do. I mean, the kind of criteria that you use, it's a very specific set of stuff that sort of weeds out a lot of what would normally happen out in the wilderness or the woods, right?
Exactly. And this didn't come about quickly. I mean, I didn't read 10, 15 cases and all of a sudden develop this list. It was after reading hundreds and hundreds of cases that you all of a sudden start to realize that the same things keep showing up. So part of that vetting process is that, number one, if somebody showed mental history of suicide, mental illness, etc., they usually got vetted out. If there was any signs of an animal attack, animal predation, that got vetted out. So right away, if search and rescue or if professional trackers came in and said, oh, this person was dragged away and there was a crime scene there with hair and blood everywhere, well, that case got sent to the side. So the primary points that came out at the beginning and still hold true is when they bring canines to the scene to track the victim, the canines either can't find a scent or refuse to search. And that's a fine line because you really don't know what they're doing. Sometimes they walk in a circle and lay down. Sometimes they go up the trail 10 feet and sit down. Professional trackers brought to the scene can't find tracks and track the victim from point to point. A lot of times, if the victim is found, their body is found in an area that had been previously searched. Now, what I mean by that is sometimes that area where they're found has been searched 20 times. In a couple of instances, the victim was found laying across a trail the search and rescue people went out and searched every day on. Now, I'll say this again so it's really clear. This is not an indictment of the search and rescue people. They do a great job. This is something unusual that's happening. And over the years, many of those search and rescue people have contacted me by email or through social media and said, hey, we know exactly what you're talking about. And it's happened to us many times, but the people running it don't want us to talk about it, and they don't want to say anything about it, but it happens a lot. Another profile point, the weather changes during the disappearance or soon after. What I mean by that is that a lot of times you'll read in these reports that at the point the person went missing, bad weather moved in, it started to rain, it started to snow, it started to get windy, fog moved in, all the above, something like that happened.
Effectively covers the tracks a little bit.
Yeah, right. And there's the geographical clustering of the cases, and this came out after about, 800 or 900 cases. Being from police work, I would often, if we were working a serial robber, rapist, or something, put a city map up on the wall, and we'd start to put pins in where the person hit last. And early on in this, I thought, just for me to keep track of where all these cases are, I'll put a map up there of the U.S., I'm going to start doing this. And all of a sudden, these clusters of disappearances start coming out. Right now, there's 59, with the largest cluster of people missing fitting our profile of Yosemite National Park. The other part of this is that a lot of times clothing or shoes are removed off the victim. A lot of times, I would say 90 to 95% of the time, the victims disappear in the late afternoon or early evening. Many of the victims either say to friends or associates that they don't feel well, or they have some type of disability that's later told to the searchers by the family. Now, I've said this on all your shows. I'll try to get through it real quickly. Originally, looking at national parks. Reason being is it's a specific area, and the national parks have a national park police. Police are really good. They're trained well. They're at 211 locations across the U.S. So you know that they're going to keep track of the stats. We filed the Freedom of Information Act request against the National Park Service for a list of missing people. Got a call from one of their attorneys asking me why I wanted the information. I said just for research. They said that they don't keep track of missing people. And I defied you to go into any medium-sized police department in the U.S. and ask their police chief for a list of missing people. And that person couldn't have a list on their desk within 30 minutes. Park Service says they don't keep a list. So I said, okay, I'd like to get a list. And they said for Yosemite, that'll be $34,000. For the entire system, $1.4 million. Jeez. Needless to say, that was shocking.
It's maybe the most amazing thing to me because, as you know, I after we had talked about some cases here in Nevada, I made some inquiries and got the same answer. So it's not something that you're making up. I mean, that's what they said. We don't have a list. This point about the victims having an illness or disability, a lot of times it's the very young. And as I saw in the new book, The Hunters, these guys are experienced woodsmen, but a lot of them are elderly people. So it's like the young, the old, the sick, the infirm. It's almost like a culling of the herd kind of a process from one perspective.
It almost seems that way. And the other part I've talked about before is sometimes these victims, and I note this in this latest book several times, the victims tell a friend or tell someone right before the disappearance that they don't feel well. And that's occurred in other disappearances in other books before. And you got to understand that these search and rescue people and the hunters that are friends with these people in the woods, these searches aren't periphery, quick, and done. These are massive searches. And it makes no sense that they don't find these people. And you come back, say, a month later, well, at that point, the body's getting pretty ripe, and you bring in cadaver dogs that can smell a dead body for miles. And the idea that they don't find any body, firearms, backpack, nothing, that doesn't make any sense.
I mean, we'll get into this later, but it's like they're taken somewhere else, and then some of them get brought back.
Oh, that's been brought up to me more than once, yes, for sure.
You've in the hunting cases, we'll get into maybe the over. We're going to take a break here in a second, but you've broken it down by the states with the most disappearances of hunters, which I think is kind of chilling. I was surprised by this. I had 2 states in mind that I thought would be at the top of the list, and they're not. So when we come back, we'll get into that list, and then we'll go down into some of the anomalies involved in the cases, specific cases that you have analyzed. Starting with one, a guy from my home state here, a guy up in Reno who went on a hunting trip up north. We're talking with David Paulides about his new book, Missing 411 Hunters, Unexplained Disappearances. In a moment, we dive into the new cases. Stick around. I had read that the characters in this song, The Wait by the band, are based on real people that were known to the members of the band, the guys who put that song together. It's a great classic. We're talking with David Paulides about his new book, Missing 411 Hunters. And some of the cases we're about to get into will chill you to the bone. I mean, the hunters experienced outdoorsmen and outdoors women. They're not all men. Most of them are, but some of them are women. They know their way around. They hunt in the same areas year after year, many of them. They are least likely to get in trouble out in the woods. They are armed. They know how to protect themselves. They know how to survive in the wilderness, but something snatches them up, takes them somewhere else. A lot of them don't come back. We're going to get into those cases in just a moment, right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Dave Paulides, if I had to guess, before I read the book, which state had the most cases of the 148 or so that you deal with in the book, I would have guessed California, only because it's such a massive population. I don't know if they've got millions of hunters, but I know hunting, it's a very active hunting state, either that or Alaska, but that's not how it breaks down. Share that with us.
So in order of disappearances, Idaho had the most with 18, Montana 13, Washington 11, Maine and Oregon were tied at 9, and Colorado had 8. And what's interesting about that stat is that Idaho also has a lot of people that weren't hunters, hikers and such, that have disappeared and never were found. Now, the most disappearances by year, 1950 had 8, 1948 had 5, and then by month, November, they had 62, October 46. That's kind of understandable because that's predominantly when hunting season's going hard. Kind of strange is that February is the 1 month out of the 12 where there were no disappearances. And then other anomalies on the list, there were 8 women that were listed in the book that I wrote about. And unbelievably, 2 of the 8 disappeared within 3 days of each other in 1950. One was in Vermont and one was in Montana, and I thought that was really strange. And then 3 hunters disappeared in different instances within 7 days of each other in Michigan. And I wrote a lengthy part of this in the book, and this was in 1909. Between November 9th and November 16th, 3 vanished and were never found in far northern Michigan. It was really, really a strange set of instances there. And then 2 age groups with the most disappearances, 22 years old and 65 years old. 22 had 7 and 65 years old had 6. So again, we're talking about those opposite ends of the spectrum. And then there's more anomalies on the list, but those are the big ones.
I mean, as you note, most of them overwhelmingly are men. I guess it probably corresponds to the fact that more men are hunters.
Oh, I think so. I think that would be logical. In some of the instances that I wrote about, a wife went with them. They went into a hunting camp, and while they were there camping, something happened, and either a child that was with them disappeared or the wife disappeared. But it was in that hunting environment where everyone was armed, and all of a sudden someone's gone, and nobody could explain how, even though there's probably hunters all over that mountain, and the people weren't found.
Let's jump into some specific cases. This guy from Reno who ends up going to Alaska, his name is Anthony Granata.
Yeah, and this case, when I first read about it, there were several unusual aspects to it, but Anthony was an accountant in Reno for a big accounting firm. Husband, father, loved the outdoors, which was one reason why he lived in Reno. Well, he drove from there to Seattle in early August 1966. And then from Seattle, he flew into Alaska. And his intention was to make hunting trips out of a city called McCarthy into the Wrangell Mountains. And he was hunting for Dall sheep and goats very high up in altitude above timberline. Well, McCarthy, it's located about 30 miles west of the Canadian border and 225 miles east of Anchorage, essentially in the middle of nowhere. And he heard about this area from several friends that the hunting was just phenomenal. And he liked to go in alone, and he did go into the mountains alone, and he shot a trophy sheep and goat in almost 3 days. And he put those on his backpack, and he was so loaded down that he made a decision to leave his rifle and other supplies on the mountain, hike out with the sheep head and the goat's head, and drop those off, then go back into the mountains to get the rest of his supplies and the rest of the meat. Well, he made friends with the caretaker of the Kennecott copper mine in McCarthy, and that was the predominant business at the time. Well, he told him that he was going to go back into the mountains, get his supplies, and return no later than August 18th. Well, when he didn't return, the caretaker called the Alaska State Troopers. Word eventually got back to Reno and his wife and kids that he was missing. Well, Anthony had a 22-year-old brother named Archie, and he was kind of who was picked by the family to go up into McCarthy and look for his brother because the wife had young kids and couldn't go. Well, Archie was a young college student. He arrived in early September, and they took him to the room where his brother had kept most of his belongings, and he found a roll of film that hadn't been developed, and he had it flown to Seattle for developing, a pretty smart thing to do. Well, within a few days, that came back, and Archie searched the room looking for facts. He couldn't come up with much. But the pictures came back, and they showed his brother with a giant Dall sheep that he had killed in the mountains. He showed the picture to locals, and they recognized the area as the Nizina Glacier, Nizina, or the McCarthy Glacier, and different articles had it named by different ways. But by now, the Civil Air Patrol, Alaska National Guard, Army helicopters, and Elmendorf Air Force Base had all committed to fly sorties into the area looking for him. Well, all of them claimed that fog inhibited their search efforts on many of these sorties because they couldn't see the ground. Well, Archie found a guide, and he left with the guide to go into the glacier. And en route there, they found one campsite that they could confirm it was Anthony's, and they confirmed that because they found a small matchbook with a Reno business on it. Well, after they left that campsite, they got into an area that was rocky, bouldery, and just essentially barren because they were above tree level. And they thought that they had found the exact area where Anthony had taken the picture with his Dall sheep based on landmarks they had seen. And they searched that area for 3 days. They found nothing. In total, the military flew 48 missions, saw nothing, found nothing. An Air Force rescue team took over the search in the short term. They found nothing. And on September 24th, 1966, the Nevada State Journal had a headline saying, "Tony walked into what has proven to be a mystery void." Now, the parts to this, he was never found, by the way, and neither was any of his equipment or his gun, nothing. Dall sheep stay really high up in the mountains above tree level. There's very little cover, so flying an air mission over that, everything will stick out. And flying from the air, you can see things for miles in that environment. And to never find his backpack, the rest of the sheep, his rifle, his other supplies, eerie.
You've talked about boulders, rocky terrain, barren, rocky stuff, granite. What is the significance of that? Is there a suggestion that some sort of a predator or something is hunting using that as camouflage or background, or is attracted to that kind of terrain, or what do you think the significance of that is?
Well, I was recently in Australia, and I did 3 talks there, and I made a presentation to them about people that were missing from their country. And the 3 areas that I highlighted all had giant mounds of boulders, granite. The number one place probably in the world for granite is Yosemite National Park, and that just so happens to be the number one place in the world for disappearances. And I've had a lot of people tell me that there's certain things in granite that are unusual, that can throw things off, and there's a lot of stories that go with that, not a lot of facts, but you can't ignore it. It's just the truth.
The other thing you mentioned in this case about Anthony is the fog that shows up that inhibits the ability to search, and there are a lot of those kinds of things that pop up. What you're suggesting is this weather sort of comes out of nowhere. I mean, we're talking about the woods and the wilderness. There's going to be bad weather, but in at least some of these cases, it's striking how quickly it comes in out of nowhere, and it almost seems designed to stop any kind of a search or picking up any scent or tracks or anything like that.
Well, and in a lot of these cases, I think the hunters are absolutely flabbergasted about the situation they get themselves into, because one of the safety things I talk about at the back of the book is, hey, before you go into the woods, one of the last things you ought to be doing is checking the weather. And, obviously in the mountains, weather changes a lot and things can go from bad to worse really quick, but you should be checking that weather before you go out and commit yourself to 2 or 3 days in the woods. But in many of these instances, just like in this case here, I don't think the hunters or the search people predicted what they were faced with.
Meaning it wasn't in the forecast necessarily.
Well, I don't think that these guys in the Air Force would be flying these sorties knowing that there was fog in that area, and they usually have some pretty good weather forecasts from their meteorologists.
I guess, the unspoken question there is, how do you manipulate the weather? Let's say there's some intelligence involved in this, in these abductions or this predatory practice. The idea that somebody could control weather on a regional basis, that's a pretty nifty skill to have.
What's funny about that is I've gotten probably over 10 emails from people in the last 5 years talking about weather manipulation, and supposedly our government and other governments have that ability to do it. Even at the minimal level, we can seed clouds and make it rain. But there's often, in many of these emails I've received, saying that the government can manipulate the weather much more than we are known to believe. Now, I don't know if it's true or not. I'm just telling you what it's been sent.
In all these cases of hunters, they have weapons of some kind, guns. Are there any of these cases, and I don't want to jump sort of too far ahead, but is there any case where anybody, it looks like they used their gun to fight back before they were taken away?
There was one case where a guy disappeared. They searched for him for months, and they found him, and his gun was broken in 2. And they set out this theory, and I go into it in the book at length, that he fought off a bear to the point where he hit the bear with his gun and broke it in half. And, I mean, the story that whoever this person came up with, it was pretty outlandish.
Wow.
And the guy ended up being found deceased under a log with severe injuries, and it didn't make a lot of sense to me. I kind of took it apart bit by bit, but there aren't a lot of those stories where you can think that there was a fight to life. And if, there are those stories out there, but they're easily understood to be, maybe it's bear predation, or maybe the person got gored by a moose or an elk or something, and that's what killed them. But not a lot of these head-to-head battles.
You mentioned in the book that bow hunters, I didn't know there were that many. I know it exists, but I didn't know there were that many, but that they are targeted maybe even more than people with firearms. There's one case, Aaron Hedges.
And the bow hunter stories are the strangest stories in the books. I can honestly say that for some reason, either they're not found or they're found under conditions that are just totally bizarre. Aaron's case is one of the most bizarre. And a super experienced hunter, and this isn't a joke. He was hunting in the Crazy Mountains. That's the name of them, in Montana. And the location was, he was about 20 miles north of Billings. He was with 3 friends, and they took the Cottonwood Lake trailhead into the Crazies. And all 3 in the group were carrying radios to communicate. So somehow during the day, this has happened about September 7th of 2014, he got separated somehow. And this is another element that I talk about in the books, is somehow, and it's unexplained how, and nobody really knows how, but they get separated. The group gets separated. Well, he gets on the radio, and he says that he missed the trail back to their camp, and he was going to go on to a place called Sunlight Lake. And he knew this location really well because there was a cache of supplies there from the previous year that he had placed, the sleeping bag, food, etc. He was going to grab some of those supplies and meet him back to camp that night. Well, the following morning, he still hadn't made it back to camp, but his friends knew he was super well adjusted to the outdoors. They didn't worry. He figured he was just going to spend the night there, hunt for some elk, and meet him the next day. And he had the supplies, and he was armed with his bow, and he knew the area super well. Well, the pair of friends that day killed an elk. They brought it back to their camp, and when Aaron didn't arrive that Monday night, the friends started to become concerned. And the friends that night stayed in position. The next morning they wake up, and they start looking for Aaron. Well, that night they didn't find him, and they got real concerned, and they left, and they started to look for assistance. So on Wednesday, they made it out of the mountains. They called Aaron's wife, reported him as missing, and they called the sheriff. Now, the press did state that the delay in reporting could have played a part in the search. Well, the men were hunting on the western side of the Crazies in Park County. This is important because the Crazies cover several different counties. So they were on the western side. On the eastern side of the mountains is Sweetgrass County. Well, the initial report stated that Aaron was lost on the western side of the mountains, and Park County took control of the search. And by the time Park County started the search, snow had started to fall, and there were soon 2 feet of snow on the ground as the search party started to go into the field. So there was a 3-day delay in getting Aaron reported missing, and then a 2-day delay in getting people into the field to search. Now, 5 days of inclement weather, chances are you're probably dead, and unless you're super well situated in the mountains and have the clothing and perseverance to survive. Well, the Park County Sheriff soon realized that Aaron could possibly have been on the border with Sweetgrass County, so he called for their assistance. Well, there's a September 28th article in the Livingston Enterprise that stated 2 weeks earlier. Now, this is obviously, he disappears on the 7th. This article's on the 28th. So they're saying on about the 14th, a week after Aaron disappears, searchers are in the field, and they found a pair of boots and a camelback, and both of them were identified as belonging to Aaron. Now, one search and rescue worker makes a statement in the article that barefoot, you're not going to go and travel far, so we searched a 1/4-mile radius, and we found nothing. So this was next to a creek. Search and rescue finds his 2 boots and a camelback. Now, there's 2 feet of snow on the ground. You're the search and rescue people. You know Aaron's not going far, if he went anywhere. So they brought 20 different canine teams into that area to see if they could pick up a scent. They found nothing. They brought in 7 equestrian teams. They found nothing. They looked for tracks leaving the area. They found nothing. 50 ground searchers found nothing. Now, they brought in a helicopter with forward-looking infrared, and they found nothing, meaning that they were looking for something emitting heat on the ground. And if you die one day, you're going to emit heat for a couple days. The National Guard flew a series of sorties. They found nothing. 15 days after the search started, they found nothing, and it was terminated. Now, 9 months later, the case takes an unusual turn, to say the least. Two men were working on repairing a fence in Sweetgrass County. One man was repairing the fence, and his dad was just kind of walking around keeping him company, visiting. Well, his dad finds a bow, a backpack, and an orange vest. And his dad said he's looking at this stuff, and he's thinking he's going to find a body because it must have been a bear that killed someone right here. And they looked around. They didn't find anything other than just this equipment. Well, the men called the sheriff, and it wasn't before long that the sheriff ID'd the property as Aaron's. Now, here's where it's almost beyond understanding. The location where the vest and the backpack was found was 15 cross-country air miles in deep snow from point to point from where Aaron's boots were found. Now, the items were found 2 miles from a ranch house. They searched the area intensively where they found this backpack, and they found nothing.
So there's no way he walked 15 miles with no boots on.
Well, let me get you to the part where they interview the lieutenant. So, remember what the SAR worker said. He said, well, Aaron couldn't travel far from the point they found the boots. That's the reason they just...
I'll tell you what, Dave, I have to interrupt you. I'm sorry. The music is telling us we need to take a break. But this story is really getting good here. The story of Aaron Hedges, 38 years old, disappears in the crazy mountains. We'll be right back with more of this right after this on Coast to Coast AM. I thought this song might be a good fit for our conversation tonight. It's called Meet Me in the Woods by Lord Huron. Kind of an eerie mood to that song, and the title certainly fits. If you are listening to us tonight from your cabin in the woods, or you live up in the mountains and it's dark and spooky where you are, you might gonna go check the latch on the door because it gets spookier from here on out. We're talking with Dave Paulides about his new book, Missing 411, focusing on hunters. And when we return, we'll pick up the story of Aaron Hedges, who was 38 years old when he went into the crazy mountains of Montana on a hunting trip and never came back. His boots are found one place. His vest and backpack are found 15 miles away. Did he walk that distance in his bare feet, in the snow? Seems unlikely. Dave Paulides picks up the story in just a moment. All right, Dave Paulides, Aaron Hedges is the hunter who disappears. His boots are found in one place, his vest and backpack a long way away. What's the deal on that?
So the locations where all this were found were pretty identifiable. And I looked on a geological survey map, and it looks like it's just over 13 air miles point to point. One article said it was 15. I got it at 13. Now, if you talk about any kind of survival expert, to go through rugged mountains, it's never point to point. It's at least double, sometimes triple, because you're going up, down, sideways. And in this instance, in the middle of winter, chances are he's not going to be crossing creeks and rivers, so it makes it a longer trip. Well, they interviewed a corporal named Greg Todd, who was the head of the Sweetgrass County Search and Rescue, and they asked him, with what you have in front of you, what he thought might have happened. And the quote he gave was, "That is the million-dollar question." And that's all he'd say. Well, then they went to Lieutenant Alan Ronenberg of the Sweetgrass County Sheriff's Department, and in the Montana Pioneer Press of October 3rd, 2015, they asked him what he thought might have happened. And I quote him, he said, "Everything from he got turned around and got off the trail, got caught in the storm, passed away off the trail from hypothermia, to he's in Mexico somewhere, to UFOs got him. There's literally a full list," end of quote. Essentially, they have no idea.
What's your guess?
What you said, George. The idea that somebody's going to walk 15, 20 miles through the snow and the mountains in the middle of winter with no boots is ridiculous.
I mean, it sounds like he was picked up, or his stuff was picked up and dropped somewhere. Talk to me about the boots, because that pops up again and again, footwear. I know there's a theory about hypothermia when it sets in, that some people react that way, that they take off their clothes or their boots, and even though it makes no sense.
There is that theory, but many of the stories I've documented, their clothes or their boots or their shoes are found so close to the place that the people were last seen that there was no time for hypothermia to set in. Or the weather wasn't such that hypothermia wouldn't have been a factor. So I don't care if it's hypothermia or not. I don't care if you're Superman or not. The idea that you're going to walk long distances in a frozen environment without boots on, it doesn't make sense. And then you take in the fact that the location where his items were found, the area around that was searched thoroughly. Well, again, that doesn't make sense either, because to make the trek and then make a decision to drop all your belongings right there, common sense doesn't follow. Now, at the location where they found his boots, they found a water bladder that he carried for drinking, and he left that there. Now, that wouldn't be something you'd want to leave behind. You'd want to take that with you if you were going to move. Well, yeah, and common sense would say, yeah, you also want to take your boots. So, a very, very odd set of circumstances, but if you read my prior books, you know that this shoe thing and sock thing comes up time and time again, and it doesn't make any sense at all.
Haven't there been, I'm trying to remember from maybe the first book, cases where the clothing is like stacked or folded, or it's just found in unusual positions, or I don't know if there have been cases where it's on the body and turned around or ill-fitting or anything like that, but that's something has messed with the clothing.
Well, there have been stories where a very, very small child, say 2 years old or younger, disappears, and they're found with their shirt on backwards, a piece of clothing on the wrong way, and the parents said the child doesn't even know how to take their clothing off. So this is who did this? That was one of the questions. In the instance you're thinking about, there was an incident in Tennessee where a small scout disappeared, and they found him laying next to a tree with his pants down to his knees, frozen to death. But then in an adjacent river, in the middle of the river, they found all of his clothes stacked and folded on a rock.
Yeah, that's weird. And I'm trying to remember, I don't want to jump too far ahead in this book either, but one of the stories, the image that is stuck in my head more than anything from this book is a guy, I don't remember which case, I can look it up in my notes here, but of a guy who was found under some unusual circumstances, and his feet were bloody down to the bone. He had not only taken his boots off, but his feet had just basically worn off. Do you remember which one that is?
Oh, yeah. Now, that was a lot of times the readers will read my stories and they'll say, but what was the condition of the feet? And a lot of times the coroner's reports won't even mention it. So in the incident you're talking about, yeah, that was a very, very unusual set of circumstances that they actually did talk about it. In that case, a man was hunting with his friend, and he told his buddy that he was going to go off and find some water and bring it back to the camp. Well, he took off, and he never came back. And his buddy that night thought something was really strange because his friend knew that area like the back of his hand. And they started a giant search. And this happened in 1952 in September. His name was James Madison. It happened in the Nez Perce National Forest in Idaho, another Idaho case, 67 years old. And this happened 14 miles east of the Red River Ranger Station. Well, these guys wanted to get an early jump on their hunting, so they took off. Well, on 9/11 of 52, they established their camp. So James goes just a short hike, it's a couple hundred yards to the creek to get some water. He doesn't return. His friend's yelling for him all night, can't find him. Next morning, still yelling for him, can't hear nothing, no response, no shots fired, nothing. So he goes to the ranger station to get help. Well, the rangers called the sheriff's deputies who brought in bloodhounds. Well, on September 16th, there were headlines in the Lewiston Morning Tribune. The headlines were "Hounds Stymied in Search." Well, a scent trail wasn't found, and the tracks weren't located leaving the area of the creek where they thought he was at. Now, on September 22nd, the Air Force flew the skies for 2 days, and they found nothing in that area. Now, the weird part about this is it's one of those instances where searchers don't find anything, but somebody else does. Well, late in the afternoon on September 24th, so this would have been, this happened on the 11th and the 24th, almost 2 weeks later, 4 hikers found something really strange in the Salmon River in a really remote section. Well, they found this man, James Madsen. He was face down, 20 feet from the shore in 18 inches of water, dead. Now, a September 26th article in the Lewiston Morning Tribune quoted, "Robertson said death was caused by exhaustion rather than drowning. Madsen was clad in his underwear and T-shirt. He was barefoot, and the soles of his feet were worn to the bone." The article further stated that he was 15 miles from his camp. He had been dead 3 to 4 days. Now, I've told this story to many people I know, and nobody I know could walk on their feet if they were that badly damaged.
Man, down to the bone. What's about the timing of? So he'd been dead for 3 or 4 days. How long was he missing?
So he was missing for almost 2 weeks.
So he'd been alive out there for wow. That's just
long time.
Just really weird. You got a couple of cases from California, and I know a lot of our listeners are in California, so maybe we'll go there. Luke Kuykendall is one. Man, there's a lot of weird stuff in this one.
Yeah, this one is a strange case. Back at September 16th, 1941, in a location called Balch, B-A-L-C-H, Hill, and that's an area about 16 miles south of a place called Dinky Creek. And that's in an area just south of Yosemite National Park, the foothills east of Fresno, California. If you read my books, Dinky, D-I-N-K-E-Y Creek comes up a lot as a place where people seem to vanish. Now, Luke was 65 years old. He was a banker in San Francisco. Always went to the same spot to hunt, always went with his same friends, a guy named E.R. Vedder and a guy named Earl Ray. And they went to this spot up by Balch Hill, and they always established their camp along with a handful of other people. Well, the first day that Luke went in there, he was staying in camp, and Vedder and Ray went out to hunt. Well, people knew that Luke had a heart condition, and so if he went out to hunt, he wouldn't go very far, but he was the guy who liked to just kind of keep the camp and make the food and kind of enjoy the outdoors, but not necessarily go out and seriously hunt, but he would go out and hunt. Well, as a short while, a few hours after these guys are gone, somebody comes running into camp saying that there's an incident out there, and a hunter was shot and they needed help. Well, Luke said, "Hey, what do you need me to do?" Well, they said, "Hey, just stay here. We're going to go get some help, and if the other people in the woods come in, you got to help them." He said, "No problem." Well, other people come back, and they said, "We're going to go out. We're going to go help the people that were shot, and you stay close in here." Well, he walked partially out to about 200 yards down the trail from camp. And people said, "Luke, just stay right here. Keep an eye on the camp." He could see the camp from where he was at, and they said, "We'll be back in a few minutes." Well, they eventually came back, and what had happened is Vedder, his friend, had actually shot his other friend, Ray, thinking he was a deer, and killed the guy instantly. And they drug the guy into camp, and you imagine the chaos. One friend shoots another, how emotional that would be, and now there's like 10 people in camp, and they're looking around, what's going on, and calling for help, and all of a sudden, everyone realized, where'd Luke go? Well, they searched around, called for him. Nothing. Well, Luke was the kind of guy, again, heart condition, couldn't walk far at all, somewhat disabled. And Luke's sons heard about the incident the next day and immediately responded into the camp. They brought in rangers, sheriffs, huge search, questioned the kids about how far their dad could go, and they said not far at all. And there was an article in the Fresno Bee. This happened September 16th. On October 1st, it said the searchers stated that Kuykendall apparently vanished as if he had sunk into the ground, no trace having been found. End of quotes. He was never found.
That's a heck of a quote.
Now, the part about this that we got to remember is that this guy wasn't a big, hairy, older, aggressive, in-shape hunter. He was, for all intents and purposes, disabled. He wasn't going far. How could we not find him?
The question of this incident where one hunter shot another, I get that from people who email me about this. They think that these explanations, in particular, before they read your book, before this book is even out, I'm already getting explanations. Well, that's what it is. It's hunters shooting other hunters accidentally and then hiding the body so they don't get in trouble for it. I'm sure that happens here and there, but it doesn't explain the cases that I'm reading here in this book.
No, and there would still be blood. There would still be a drag trail. If you're going to bury somebody, actually, the body still emits gases and things, and you could,
dogs would find it.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if you think about that case I just told you, which is only probably 30 miles, 40 miles away from Yosemite, just outside the national park boundaries. That occurred in September 16th, 41. Fast forward almost 2 years to July 18th, 1943, and a man named Emerson Holt inside Yosemite National Park. Now, I'm going to tell you what happens here, and it sounds so eerily similar, it's weird. So, again, Emerson's 55 years old. He's from Riverside. He goes to Yosemite with a group of friends, and they're on the floor in Yosemite Valley. Super congested area, but the weird part about this is that a lot of people disappear on some of the main trails in that valley rather than in the back trails of the national park. His friends decide that they're going to hike to a place called Lake Merced. Well, the trail is like an improved large dirt road. It's an unmistakable path, and it's directly adjacent to the Merced River. Well, as the group neared the location that they were headed at Lake Merced, Emerson tells his friends that he doesn't feel well. And he said that he wanted to stay right where he was, and he wasn't going to move because he didn't know if it was the altitude or whatever, but he just didn't feel right. Well, he wasn't in very good shape. He was somewhat disabled, and he goes, I'm not going anywhere. You guys have fun. Well, his friends come back within an hour. He's not there. Well, the Merced River next to where he was only inches deep. It was barely flowing up there that year. Huge search. Nothing. And there were no deep pools. There was nothing in that area that would attract somebody or would hide a body. Well, there's a July 23rd UPI article that states, search parties today continue to look for Emerson Holt, 55 of Riverside, whose disappearance in Yosemite National Park Monday was considered, quote, almost supernatural, unquote, by Park Superintendent Frank Kittredge. Holt was never found.
Well, it's even more supernatural when you realize there had been another incident almost identical to it 2 years before. I mean, I can't imagine that the superintendent, if he had been there that long, wouldn't have remembered that one. You'd think.
Well, if they don't keep lists of people, who knows?
Yeah, that's right. Maybe they did back then.
I think they still do. What do you think, George?
I mean, I'm going to use the word, it's an abduction. I'm not saying who's doing the abducting, who or what, but that's what it sounds like. These are abductions. Is that too far afield?
Well, you know what's weird in my world is that every once in a while you catch an article where the national park person or the law enforcement person kind of puts their guard down and really says what they think, like Kittredge did there, something supernatural. And like the guy did on Hedges' case, a UFO picked him up and took him. I think they say that stuff when they're not being protected, and when they're talking amongst friends, that's what they're saying.
I'll bet there's a lot of them that talk amongst themselves. Your search and rescue folks who occasionally give you little glimpses into what they're saying to each other, whispering to each other, rather.
There's no doubt. And every once in a while I'll get an email from somebody saying, well, Dave, this is hard to believe that this case really happened because we've never heard about it. Well, I can almost guarantee that 99% of the cases in this book, people have never heard about them. But what's going to happen is all of a sudden there's going to be stories in different venues about these incidents because they're so strange.
I'm curious whether you have any Park Service rangers coming forward since we've begun these conversations. We're going to go to a break here in a second. I'll let you think about that, how to answer it. But you know that there are some of those folks out there who have information. I'm sure a lot of them have explanations that they would like to. I'm going to set that Dave Paulides straight. But I'll bet there's some stories that even you have not heard. When we come back, we're going to pick up these tales about the missing hunters, and there's some really good ones still to come. Stick around, everyone. Remember this band? They're called Wishbone Ash. The song is from 1980. The title is sort of what we're looking for, what we're seeking tonight. It's called Living Proof. The song into the break was John Fogerty in Mystic Highway. I had my nephew who's 10 years old, Ethan. He visited me this weekend, and I started telling him about Coast to Coast and the show that I sometimes host, and he stops me in the middle of a sentence. He already knows all about it. He listens to Coast. He's listening tonight, in fact, and I'm not sure that's a good idea because this is pretty creepy stuff. Our conversation with Dave Paulides about the missing 411 hunters. Still to come, the spookiest, weirdest case of all the books that Dave has written about these mysterious disappearances. This is the creepiest. The person involved did not, in fact, disappear, but encountered something and got a picture of it. And I think it is pointing us in a direction of at least a better understanding, if not absolute answers. So don't go away. That's still coming up here on Coast to Coast AM. A couple of years ago, when Dave Paulides came to Las Vegas area to both investigate a couple of cases from this region and also to do some stuff with us for TV News, a series we put on the air, I got a chance to see him sort of in operation. A lot of these cases that are investigated, it's not as simple as going online and finding information because they only get reported in tiny little newspapers and little regional areas, hometown papers that aren't necessarily online. A lot of these cases are old, so none of that stuff gets posted. Dave, talk about that for a second, the difficulty. I saw you here going through some pretty obscure little periodicals looking for leads in a couple of particular cases. It's painstaking work to track this stuff down, isn't it?
And, sometimes I think those are the obstacles that are placed in front of us, and the powers to be know that. And I think if you're not adept at really maneuvering your way through the internet and having some phone etiquette to get people to help you in some of these small libraries in these corners of the state where no one visits, chances are you're not going to get much. But every once in a while, you'll get somebody on the phone who's very helpful, and wow, we never even knew that happened, and they were never found. No, and there was a couple counties up in Montana where I actually got the sheriff on the phone and I explained to him, there was this case back in the late 50s, and I'm looking for information about it. He goes, wow. He goes, I've never heard of it. And then one of his deputy sheriffs called like a couple days later and goes, you're right, we never did find that person, and we don't even have a file on him. He goes, how embarrassing is that? And so this happens a lot. There's a case in this book about a small boy who was hunting with his family in Washington and disappeared. And I got maybe 8 or 10 articles about it, and I called the sheriff there. I got a hold of their records, and they said, well, we don't have anything. And they just wanted to slough it off. And I said, well, this boy was never found. And they said, well, we can't do anything. So I finally called the assistant sheriff, and he goes, really? And he goes, let me go see what I could find. And he calls me back a week later, and he goes, unbelievably, in 2 warehouses, we had archived microfiche. And he goes, we have it. And they sent me the entire case file, and it was one of the most bizarre things I've ever read. But he was apologetic, and a lot of these jurisdictions, if a case is 5 years old or older, they just dump it. And many people don't know that there's a classification, missing presumed dead, that the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service use a lot. And this is the way for them to clean their records and not say, well, we don't have any missing people there. No, it's because they're presumed dead. So we don't have that report anymore, and they're just gone. So many of the cases that I write about, you're not going to find them in any database. You're not going to find them anywhere, and people have just forgotten about them. And it's a sad state, and every once in a while, family members will get a hold of you and say, wow, thanks for at least trying to resurrect this, because nobody even wants to talk about it.
It's kind of a double-edged sword. You know, you have those cases where they find a technicality as a way to say it's closed or it's no longer active, or they say, oh yeah, that's an open case. We can't give you the records.
Yeah, that is so funny you said that, because I would say, depending on the jurisdiction and depending on the circumstance, I hear that maybe 40% of the time. 60% of the time, if the case is an older one, it's like they've lost interest in it and they'll give it to you. But a lot of times they won't. And the unusual part of that is that a missing persons case is one of the only things in law enforcement that they investigate that isn't criminal. Because a missing person still hasn't been classified as a homicide or a kidnapping. They're missing. And it's not against the law to go missing. And if George Knapp wants to just fall out of society and not show up to work one day, you're not.
But which is, by the way, I have that feeling often.
Yeah, well, that's what we're worried about, George. But you're not committing a crime. It may be immoral, and you may be not meeting financial responsibilities, but nothing criminal. And so a lot of times law enforcement loses interest in those rather rapidly. And unless there's something else that tweaks it, very little investigation's ever done.
Just a quick comment, and then we'll go back to some questions I had in mind about librarians. You know, before the Internet was so big, that was not your first stop. When you'd be working on a case that has some history involved, you had to check the newspaper archives or indices. The library would often be the first stop, and I've found librarians to be an incredible resource. They want to be asked to help with stuff. They love a challenge. And I'm sure you've experienced the same thing. I wanted to ask about Park Service folks, though. Before the break, I'm sure you get a range of different reactions from them. Retired folks, some people who want to give you information but can't. I know from seeing the film, which we'll be talking to your son Ben about later, that there are some folks who've been on the inside who do talk to you and help try to resolve this. In general, have you had some help, some people come forward since these projects, the project began a few years ago?
You know, sometimes just dumb luck, you fall into things. And I was with a friend of mine, and we were up at Rocky Mountain National Park, and we're on one of the main trailheads that go up to Long's Peak. And they have this little hut there and a little tiny National Park Service office. And I'd never been there, so we walked up there, and there's these 4 or 5 older guys that are sitting inside this employee hut talking, and they're kind of talking openly about work, and you could tell that they were all current or former National Park Service employees, and they were talking about interesting stuff. And so I told my friend, I said, hey, we're going to wait right here, because one of these guys, whoever the first one to leave, I'm going to talk to him. Eventually, one of these guys gets up and he walks out to the parking lot, and I stop him, and I introduce myself, and said, I'm a retired law enforcement guy, and I've been investigating missing people in national parks, and this is kind of what I've been faced with. And he's all ears. He's like Mr. Polite, and he goes, yeah, Dave. He says, I know what you're talking about. And I said, why would they be doing this? And I said, and, you know, you obviously used to work here or something, because I could tell you're a former employee. He goes, I'm a retired National Park Service special agent. That's like hitting a gold mine. and he was super nice. He says, Dave, I hate to tell you this because it's embarrassing, but it's a complete lack of integrity in the National Park Service law enforcement branch. And he says, I was faced with it for an entire career. He told us at one point he was making a case against the National Park Superintendent for theft, and he was told by his powers to be that they were told to just drop it and forget it. And he goes, that kind of told me that there's no integrity here. And super nice man, answered all my questions, but that was probably the biggest gold mine I ever hit. Because, well, in the movie, in one of the segments that we had filmed, and we didn't use it in the movie, it involved a park where a family lost their dad. And one of the people at the park said, yeah, you want to go talk to this former park employee. And it was a National Park Service ranger that had left. And he was another gold mine for telling us the ins and outs of the National Park Service and how, in his mind, how corrupt it was and how they didn't do the right thing when they needed to do the right thing. And he says, eventually, I had to leave because my morals would be compromised by doing what they wanted me to do. And there was another instance in that same segment where the National Park Service told us to talk to this one ranger. He was going to be the point person for this interview about this missing person. This guy was the nicest guy you'd ever want to meet. And we got him alone. And he says, hey, we know you know more. And we know you were told not to talk. And he's like hiding his face, and he goes, I was told not to talk to you guys. And he goes, I got to be really careful, otherwise I could lose my job. And I said, well, what's the truth? Why isn't the superintendent coming out of his office to talk to the victim's family about what's being done on their missing person? Nobody will come out and talk to the victim's family. He goes, it's an embarrassment, isn't it? I go, yeah. He goes, I'm supposed to be the front person, but I can't even talk to you about it. He goes, I can only tell you exactly what they told me I could say. And, you know, from that conversation, somebody way, way up in the National Park Service is pulling the strings on this. And that was the consensus of the entire film crew there, that the people at that park had no control over what they were doing. And going way back to an incident in the Smoky Mountains National Park, where we interviewed the father of a missing person, he told us back then, he says, you know, the superintendent of a park is just a figurehead. Somebody way, way up is telling that person exactly what to do all the time. And he goes, in 6 weeks working around that man, I could tell he could never make a decision. He always had to call and get direction. So in some ways, the people that you meet are probably some of the nicest people you'll ever meet, especially the people on the trail that you meet that are the rangers. They don't know what's going on. But once you get down into the minutia and you see that there really is some lacking of integrity on these things, and it's just not one incident. There's time after time where you meet these people, these victims, where they've lost a loved one. It's like the National Park Service does not give a darn about them, and isn't embarrassed about showing it either.
Well, I think that's fair to say about certain levels of the hierarchy because you've run into it so often and it's well documented. I do think that there are people of integrity in the National Park Service. In fact, I know that there is a special investigator, somebody that you would classify as a gold mine, listening tonight and trying to make up his mind about whether he buys this scenario or not. And I don't want you to discourage people, make them so mad by painting them with a broad brush that those who might be on the fence about wanting to help would go the other way. That's, you know this a lot better than I do, but let me ask about a couple of other cases, and then at the top of the hour, I want to get into the one I hinted about, the really strange one that there's a photo involved. I should also say it involves one of the best-known luminaries in the UFO world, but if that isn't enough of a tease, I don't know what would be. There was a case in 1993, Red Rock Reservoir, a guy named Jeremiah Harris. You remember that one? And I think that's kind of an example where a case that just gets no publicity at all or hardly any, but that's about to change.
Oh, that was a complete fluke I found this, and it was buried deep, 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 so no one could ever find it. And in fact, there were some articles written that seemed to gloss over the main facts behind the case. But December 4th, 93, Jeremiah Harris, 18 years old, went deer hunting with a series of friends, Red Rock Reservoir in Knoxville, Iowa. Well, the group left real early in the morning. They get near the reservoir and they decide to split up and hunt in pairs. As is the case in many of these, somehow or another they got separated. And Jeremiah's partner couldn't find him. Well, later in the day when the group decided to meet up at the cars, Jeremiah never showed up, so his friends contacted the Madison County Sheriff. Well, the search formally got started the next morning, and there were bloodhounds that were brought into the scene, and planes searched from the air. Ground searchers just absolutely covered the landscape, and his parents, everyone's parents, were just searching to no end, trying to find out what happened to the young guy. Well, the search ended the first day with the dogs not finding a scent, and the other efforts, the planes and the ground teams, not finding anything. Well, Tuesday morning, a deputy was searching a farm that was searched the previous day from the air and on the ground. And they were just going over the same area before they started to expand the perimeter. Well, there was an article December 7th, 3 days later, in a newspaper called the Daily Reporter. And this is what it said. The body was near a brush pile not far from the pond. And that's all the facts that article said. And I read it, and I thought, okay, nothing here. It sounds like a mundane death, kind of strange. But another article, the same day, in the Oskaloosa Herald, had quite an amazing story, quite different than that. And it says, hunter dies of exposure. Then it goes on to say, Dr. Gordon Arnott Sr., county coroner, said it appears the man tried to cross a partially ice-covered pond at night and became soaked. Harris got back to land and took off his clothes to dry and crawled into a tree where he died. Searchers found him here this morning. He just died of exposure, apparently, Arnott said. Now, let's go back to that again. So, he supposedly falls in a pond. He gets out of the pond on this farm's property, and in the middle of the night, he takes off his clothes and crawls into a tree where he dies. Logic there? He was wearing an orange hunting vest, and that was found on the ground next to the tree and the pond. So, if he's wearing the orange hunting vest, and that's seen, why wasn't it seen from the air when they were doing the flyovers? And if he was on a farm, why didn't he go into the farmer and get assistance? Now, you would think that the clothes would dry faster if they were hanging from the tree. And you got to remember, it was December. There were no leaves in the tree.
Yeah, on a farm. I mean, does this farm have a barn?
Exactly.
And didn't you have, there's another incident that you had written about before, sort of a coincidence involving a farmer?
Well, you know what's weird about this is just 8 miles from where this incident happened, I wrote in another book about a farmer who disappeared and was never found. And you think about the size of the United States, just 8 miles away? I looked at this and I said, I recognize this city. And I looked it up and I said, wow. But even a stranger coincidence is, as I'm researching this case and running the name Jeremiah Harris through various databases, this is bizarre. I get an archive search and I find that another Jeremiah Harris died on the same day, December 7th, 93, in Fort Collins, Colorado. And in that incident, that Jeremiah Harris was with another 16-year-old friend, and he was found dead in a creek. I'm scratching my head going, how many Jeremiah Harrises can there be?
Who die on the same day?
Yeah.
That's really creepy. I mean, that's a really creepy coincidence. I don't know. Synchronicity? I don't know. I don't even know what to call that.
Yeah, I saw that, and I thought, I had to read it 3 times before I finally understood how much parallel there was there.
In the next segment, on the other side of the break, I want to get into this mega case, this very, very weird case. It's one that you use to sort of close this book and kind of leave people with their jaws dropped. Before that, there's a list of things that you tell people. We got about 2 minutes before we go to a break. There's a list of things that you tell people, advise them if they're going to Yosemite, if they're going out into the woods, that they should do. Why don't we go over some of that right now before I forget to ask you about it, because you'll be here for one more hour.
So the first thing is you got to tell somebody that you trust where you're going and when you're coming back. And when you come out, you're going to call this person and tell them you're okay. And it's got to be somebody you trust. So if you don't come back, they're going to call authorities. Check the weather before you leave. That's a key point. Carry a GPS trail device and a hard copy of the map. Carry extra water and energy bars, obviously. Carry a real cheap plastic whistle. Doesn't have to be expensive. I personally carry a satellite phone every time I go into the woods. And I also carry an emergency locator beacon. And what that is that when I activate it, it sends a message up to a satellite, goes into NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, that somebody needs help, and they dispatch search and rescue. Those things cost between $150 and $300. If you're a hunter and rescue, those things cost between $150 and $300. If you're a hunter, I would say 95% of the cases in this book would probably be solved, and you'd be found if you carried one of these devices. If you want to be macho and you don't want to tell anybody, put it in your backpack, don't tell anybody. Carry an emergency blanket with you all the time, an orange, bright orange one, about the size of a cell phone. Firearms, if you're going into the woods and you're hunting, you ought to be carrying extra rounds. Amazing how many hunters don't know an international distress signal is firing 3 rounds into the air.
I'll tell you what, the song is telling us we need to take a break. When we come back, I want to ask you about cell phones, whether that's any help at all, whether any of these people who got snatched had cell phones with them. We're talking with Dave Paulides. In a moment, we get into a really, really weird case. Eagles, Victim of Love. Take us into the break. That's the ethereal, eerie guitar work of the great Robin Trower from 1974's Bridge of Sighs album. The song is called In This Place. We're talking with Dave Paulides, who will be here for the rest of this hour. In hour 4, we'll be joined by Ben Paulides, who has directed a film version, sort of the movie version of the Missing 411 books. In this hour, we're going to get into a case that it knocked my socks off when I read it, and it's one that it reminds me of some of the material that we encountered and investigated at Skinwalker Ranch. So that should tell you how strange it gets. And it involves the family of a name that would be very well known to listeners of this program. And if that's not enough of a tease, I don't know what is. We'll be right back and jump into it in a couple of minutes here. Stay with us here on Coast to Coast AM. So, Dave, before the break, we were talking a couple of topics that I want to return to. One was about, the level of cooperation you get from the National Park Service, and I would think you'd want to keep those channels open. The other was about advice for people who are going out into the woods, especially into some of these places that are known as clusters for these vanishings or disappearances. And the one particular piece of equipment I was concerned about was cell phones. Do they help at all, or does it matter at all?
It's surprising how many areas in the woods where you wouldn't think you'd have cell reception, but you do. And the cell phone can be used for a lot of different things that it may not be readily come to your mind when you're out there in the woods, but I have a flashlight tool on mine and some other things that could be useful while you're in the woods. Always take it. But in a lot of the cases I write about, the people are somehow separated from the phone, which is kind of strange. But absolutely, always carry your cell phone with you. One of the things that we talked about before was cooperation. And one of the things I like to think that I pride myself in is being able to get along with different people from different venues. And And that's why I think I got that National Park special agent retired to talk to me. And I'm this guy who lives in the world of facts. I don't come up with these wild hypotheses. I don't make a lot of radical judgments. Like I said about search and rescue people, they're all great people. This is not it's not an indictment of them in any way. And the same with the National Park Service. The people you know and that you see at the national parks, they're some of the best people in the world. And they're not the ones making these decisions, and they're not the ones that have the visibility on the issues. In the movie, we actually interviewed the former head of the Department of the Interior. And I won't say what happens there, but it's pretty enlightening what happens. And I just want to say that those people from the national parks, hey, when you're in trouble, they're going to be the first ones out there looking for you. And they're going to risk their life to try to save you. And without them, we would be in a world of hurt. So don't think that this is an indictment of all of the national parks people or all of the search and rescue people. It's far from it. It's an extremely lopsided thing. 99.99% salt of the earth, great people, and we're lucky to have them.
Yeah, I was thinking that, the ones that I've dealt with, I mean, they're in that job because they love the land. They love the parks. They like to protect it and take care of it and the people who visit there. So, yeah, my experience has been pretty positive. But, of course, I haven't traveled the same road that you had or tried to accomplish the same thing to such intensity. I want to ask about this case that I've been alluding to for a while now. Man, it just came out of the blue as I'm reading this book, and it was like a punch to the gut. It is, and it really does remind me of Skinwalker Ranch, which we can get into after you tell the story. Go ahead.
Well, I should premise this that in all of my books, you won't read about a story like this. And over the years, I've had dozens and dozens of stories come to me from people about weird things that happened to them out in the woods, out on the trail. One of these things, like I just said, I kind of live in this world of facts. Well, there's a series of facts associated with this story that confirm something really weird happened, and that's why I wrote about it. Otherwise, I would just discount it, say, and not call a person a liar, obviously, but I couldn't prove it, so I would ignore it. Now, in this one, it was forwarded to me by several people, and I said, okay, I need to look at this. And when I started to look into it, right away, because of who was involved, and I knew the person, and I've gone to them in the past for technical information and reiteration of facts and expertise. The person is beyond reproach as the most credible person you could ever come across. And I don't know if you've had the same feelings, but you,
oh yeah,
you know that
I know him well, and I agree with your assessment completely.
So anyhow, what happened was that there was a story out there, and this person had documented it and wrote about it. So I called this person and I said, hey, this is an amazing story. I'd like to kind of bring it into my world and see how much I can back up and see what's credible. And obviously you thought the reporting person was credible, but I'd like to interview him. And he kind of giggles. He goes, it was my wife. I says, oh, my God. I says, well, could I interview her? He goes, absolutely. So I was given access, and nobody knew about this until it came out in the book who this person really was. But kind of the background on it was this woman was a bow hunter. And this is a part of the story that immediately caught my attention because, as I told you earlier, it seems like an abnormal number of bow hunters disappear. So they were in an area kind of in central United States, fairly near the Great Lakes area. And that's another thing that caught my attention because I've talked openly on your show that there's a lot of disappearances that ring the Great Lakes all the way around it. And I can't make out why it's happening, but it does. So anyhow, she goes into this deer stand and kind of an area near her house where she's gone many times. And her deer seat is about 15 feet up in the air, wooded acreage about a mile from a high school. Now, if she was using a firearm, she wouldn't be there, but she's bow hunting. So, and she was in the seat at about 5:30 in the afternoon, late afternoon. Well, at 6:21, she starts taking some photos with her BlackBerry. And as she's sitting there, she says all of a sudden the woods go completely silent. She said it caught my attention right away. Everything stops. Well, now what's weird about that is I've talked on your show and Nori's show that I've been hunting before, and the exact same thing happened to me. And the hunter I was with was 70 years old. He said, Dave, that's never happened to me before. Let's sit down, and you take one side of the tree, I'll take the other, and we're going to sit here until the sound comes back. Something weird is going on. Well, she knew it was weird, and she said, I held my phone up, and I was texting some friends. And I had my phone in one hand, and I'm looking across from me, kind of across this trail that she was on, and she's looking at trees 15 to 20 feet in front of her. And she says she couldn't believe what she was looking at. She goes, she thought she had something in her eye at the beginning, but then she said it reminded her of looking at something that was wrapped in saran wrap, meaning that you could kind of see through it, but it was almost distorted, but there was a distinct figure there, but it was distorted. And she first noticed it in a tree across from her. And she goes, now I'm holding the BlackBerry in one hand, and I'm so fixated on this object and so scared she didn't know what to think, until she sees the object jump from one tree to another tree. Not any closer to her, but keeping that 15 to 25-foot distance. Well, it was 6:20, 6:23 at about that time, and she says she's scared out of her mind, but she's not going to leave the blind. And it slowly moves out of her view and disappears. And she goes, now she has to think about what she's going to do. She's in this blind. She's got her bow and arrow. Sound eventually comes back, but there's no deer, there's no animals, there's nothing. So she goes, okay, so I waited out about 90 minutes, and I get out of there, and I go straight back to the car and her home. Well, she gets in the house, and they were having friends for dinner. And she doesn't know how to really approach what just happened. And she decides to just kind of keep it to herself until dishes are done. And she checks her computer, and she has a message from her nephew, who's in the band, marching band, at the high school that's a mile away from her hunting blind. And in the message, she says that her nephew, and she brings her husband over to see this. And the nephew explains that the entire band sees this bright object in the sky right above them as they're on the field. And it moves kind of sideways, and it circles around, and it starts out large, and it gets continually smaller until it disappears. And then 5 minutes later, the same object appears, and it does the same thing. And this was going on between 7:50 that night and 8 o'clock. Well, later on that night, the people leave, and she starts talking to her husband about what happened. And she goes, I had the phone in my hand, but I don't know what happened. I might have taken a picture, I might have not. And the husband looks at the phone and goes, yeah, you took a picture at 6:23. And he goes, boy, this is a weird-looking picture. And when you look at the picture, I'd say 90% of the photo is blurry. But then right in the middle, kind of on the left side, there's like a long piece of hair that's curly, but there's many pieces to that one curly segment. And her husband goes, that's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And so he's one of the smartest guys you'll ever meet in your life, and he starts going through the BlackBerry, looking at the pixelization, and the next day they call Verizon, and they send him the picture, and they go, tell us how this happened. And they go, well, technically, it's impossible for that camera to take that picture. And he goes, what do you mean? He goes, based on the size of the pixelization, that camera can't take that picture. But because of the numbering on the photo and the timing, we can guarantee that the camera did take the picture, but it's impossible it did take the picture. And the husband says, well, that is really strange. And they go into this big talk and about what she saw, and he's listening, and he goes, well, that sounds like this movie that I saw. And he puts on the movie Predator. And he goes, they fast forward to the segment, and he goes, tell me if that's what you saw. And she goes, oh my God, that is exactly the type of distortion I saw in that tree. Well, now, what really catches me about this is, first of all, the photo. The timing of the photo, the impossibility of the photo, and who's involved in looking and deciphering the specific facts behind the photo. People go missing in the late afternoon or early evening. Bow hunters go missing more than others. The timing of the incident with the anomaly and the incident in the air above the band members and the proximity to the Great Lakes and the cluster zones in that area, I said, you know what? I've never done this before. I'm going to put it in the book. I'm going to put it in the book because there's too many facts to support this incident really happened.
Let's give the name.
Well, the name's in the book. I mean, I've said that. Yeah. I don't know how many thousands of people are going to read it, but the man was Bruce Maccabee, and he's an optical physicist. And if there was anybody in the world that would be able to take that camera apart and the BlackBerry apart to understand why it did what it did, it would have been Bruce. And the weird thing was that this happened to somebody in his family. It's unbelievable.
Dr. Bruce Maccabee, well-renowned, well-regarded optical physicist who has done a lot of photo analysis in the UFO world. He's given briefings to CIA. He's well-regarded by pretty much everybody who knows him. So his credibility is pretty good. He writes about this, but doesn't identify that the person who had the experience is his wife. It's interesting that, as I alluded to a little bit ago, it was an almost identical kind of experience on the Skinwalker Ranch, that ranch in Utah that Colin Kelleher and I had written about. I think the incident happened in 1995, where the rancher and his son and a visitor to the property saw what they later described as just exactly like the thing in the Predator movie, moving through the bushes. It comes out of the bushes as if it's sort of some kind of technical camouflage, and it has this encounter and scares the heck out of this visitor who was on the property. And, it made me think of that immediately. Like, maybe there is technology involved in this, that whatever is out there is using technology to camouflage itself as part of a predatory activity involving humans. And you come pretty close to almost saying that in the book. And I know you don't like to pin yourself down, but I mean, you have the chapters called The Predator Story.
Well, I think that the one thing that kind of throws this into the really weird zone is the photo she takes of this kind of hair in this blurry background. And Bruce went through an exhaustive analysis of how that couldn't have been a picture of, her name is Jan, of Jan or her hair. It had to have been taken straight forward based on a lot of things with the sun and the angles, and he's way smarter than me, so I couldn't even explain it adequately, but it had to have been taken at the object that she was facing. And why would this object appear to have some kind of hair on it that is, it's pretty obvious in the photo that's what it is.
You look at the big picture, Dave, and I know, again, you don't like to say what it is or what it isn't, but the big picture is it's been going on a long time. It's over a wide area. It's not just one person or one thing doing it. It's got to be something that gets around. It acts like a predator. Some people essentially they get abducted. Sometimes the bodies are found. Sometimes the bodies are not found. A lot of times there's nothing found. It acts like it's culling a herd. It takes weak and feeble, sick, young, old people who can be plucked. It acts with impunity. It's not intimidated by weapons. It's like a harvesting of some sort. I mean, I don't know how else you describe it.
Well, going back to the ranch scenario, one of the things when I read that book, and it's an outdoor environment. There isn't a lot of big population zones around where the ranch was, and one of the things in all of my research, I always kept my eyes open about that part of the country for missing people. And there really weren't a lot of missing people around the ranch. In fact, in the book I just read, there was only a couple of people in that Utah area that that went missing that I wrote about that were pretty unusual, but that specific area, there was almost nothing.
Well, I have to agree with that assessment. And then the ranch itself, although a lot of really strange stuff, a lot of violent stuff happened, it wasn't to humans. It was to animals. There was a lot of mental torture and psychological effects, but no humans were ever hurt. You're right. I don't know of any kind of vanishings or disappearances in the 20 years that we've been working on that.
Yeah, one of the things I always get asked at conferences is, well, what kind of, because I've told you already in this show that I get a lot of strange stories told to me by hunters and outdoorsmen, et cetera, but I haven't written about them, again, because there's not this trail of evidence like there is in this incident. But one of the stories that was told to me a couple of years ago by an elk hunter in Colorado, northern Colorado, he was hunting just above tree line, really high. He was alone. And he feels this rumbling in the ground, and he thought, well, maybe there's a herd of elk coming at me, so I better start paying attention. He turns and kind of levels his rifle out towards this meadow area that's coming up over this mound at him. And he was in thick grass, and he said that he saw the grass separating and kind of going from left to right at an equidistance from him, say maybe 150 feet or so. And he said he could see the grass separating. He could feel the earth moving, but he couldn't see anything. And he says it was almost as though you took a snowplow and you plowed an area in front of it from left to right until you lost sight of it and it stopped rumbling and it disappeared. He says it was the weirdest thing he ever saw. He's never seen it again. And he says, I won't go back to that area, and I left the mountain after that. But he goes, I couldn't even tell you what happened.
We're going to take a break here. Tom Petty, Shadow People, takes us into the break. When we come back, I'll open up the phone lines with a couple of your quick, direct questions for Dave. And then I want to ask him about the few people who've returned who have some recollection of what happened to them. They tell some unusual stories about what happens to their minds during these incidents. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with David Paulides about his new book, Missing 411, Hunters, Unexplained Disappearances, and it does not disappoint. As we just mentioned, we just heard this incredible story that was first told by Dr. Bruce Maccabee, optical physicist. What he didn't make public is that the incident happened to his wife, who was out bow hunting in a wooded area not too far from their home. She encounters this thing that's sort of like from the movie Predator, same kind of sort of a cameleo-type creature in the trees, similar to what had been seen on the Skinwalker Ranch years before. She fires off a photo that, according to the company that controls the cell phone account, she shouldn't have been able to do, not technically anyway. And then a couple of minutes later, nearby, some multiple witnesses at a high school see what appears to be a UFO. Quite a coincidence. I should mention that the photo that was taken by Mrs. Maccabee is in the book, and you'll have to see it yourself and figure out what the heck that means. We'll take a couple of your calls for my guest, Dave Paulides. So a lot of folks will be on the lines. Please be courteous to your fellow Coast to Coast listeners and get right to the point. We'll be right back. A quick mention that if you're going to buy the book, Missing 411, Amazon is not the place to look for it. You should go to the link that we provided on the Coast to Coast website, canammissing.com. And I guess there's a lot of folks who have complained to us before. They see Dave's books that are being sold online for $65 or $70, and it's not him that's doing it. It's other folks, right, David?
That's correct.
I want to ask one more question, then we'll go to the phones. You have a couple of cases where people survive these strange encounters. They come back. Their memories are kind of foggy about what happened to them. Or you have cases where witnesses get glimpses of what happens to their friends, their fellow hunters, and it's almost like they're not under their own control, that there's some kind of mind control exerted, that the people are acting in a way that suggests that somebody else is calling the shots. Am I overstating that?
The majority of the time when it fits the profile and you go out and you interview the people, the reporters and things get stories like, I don't really remember what happened. It's all kind of blurry to me. I'm not sure when I got lost or if I got lost. A couple of times people have stated that they've seen things in the woods that, strange, like people looking at them from behind bushes and things like that. There's some really strange responses when you get down to the minutia. And like I said earlier, a lot of times the press will report one thing and the facts are another. And every once in a while, a reporter will go out and actually print the truth about what happened. So it's very strange.
I mean, some of these cases, it's like they walk into another reality, and then later their clothes are returned, or sometimes the bodies are returned, but they just go somewhere else, or they're taken somewhere else.
Well, and for some reason, many times they can't recollect exactly what did happen.
Yeah. First-time caller, Daniel, who is calling from the Great Lakes area. Hi, Daniel. Welcome to Coast to Coast.
Hello, George. Thanks for taking my call. David, also. I really appreciate it. I'll be quick so I don't keep the guest. I'm shooken right now. I'll tell you, I work for a business that's government contract, and it's really highly classified stuff going on here. And I take breaks at the specific spot, and I don't anymore. And when you told the story, I mean, I automatically thought the Predator. I was sitting there, and I saw the exact same thing what you were talking about. And it seemed blurry. It seemed like the Predator. And I'm thinking, could it be, this is my question, do you think that it could be either, are you familiar with the white hats and the black hats, aliens?
I don't know. George? I'm not. No, I don't know what you mean. White hats,
okay,
black
sorry.
hats.
They're either friendly or unfriendly, and the black hats are the unfriendlies. Do you think that possibly what I saw, or I think I saw, I have to see it twice to even believe it, because I'm even afraid to tell people. You guys are the first people I've told because I don't want to sound crazy, but do you think that though what I saw could be getting close to this building or entering the building? This building is basically the size of a small town, and a lot of really classified stuff goes on here. Do you think that they could be getting close to there or entering the building to try to see what's going on, try to get intelligence, or what's your take on that?
George, that's probably your answer.
Well, I mean, he doesn't have many of the details. Neither do I about what you saw or where it is. So, we had a guest on a couple of months ago who wrote a book called Camelio, who suggested that we have already developed, our government has developed some sort of a camouflage technology that allows people to be essentially invisible. So, the idea that somebody would use that to enter a classified location where sensitive information is stored, that's entirely possible. But we might be talking about two different things. If humans and spy agencies are developing this technology, they might have got the idea from somebody else. The kind of thing that Dave is talking about has been going on for a very long time over a very broad area out in the middle of nowhere. So you know what, Daniel, if you want, you can leave your name and contact information with our screener, Donna, and perhaps Dave would like to talk to you a little bit further. But we just don't have enough information. I think, I don't want to put Dave on the spot, but don't really have enough information to make a guess about it. I do appreciate you calling and sharing that story with us. We're going to go east of the Rockies. Bobby in Boston. Hi, Bobby. Good morning. Hello. Bobby's gone. How about Nat in Dayton, Ohio on the wild card line? Hi, Nat. Is Nat there in Dayton? Hello. Are you on the air? You there? All right. Going to go east of the Rockies now and try Juan in Atlanta, Georgia. Hello, Juan.
Hi. Hi, George.
Howdy.
Good luck to your West Georgia Wolves in the upcoming football season.
Oh, good.
Okay.
What's on your mind?
Okay. I want to ask Mr. Paulides a question. Have you been have you looked into the 1,000 to 3,000 cases of missing or murdered First Nation women and young ladies up in Canada? That's become a little bit of a scandal up there because they haven't been, basically they've been ignored by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and local police up there.
Yeah, the Highway Tears case.
Yes, I think that's part of it. I think it goes even more expansive than that.
The problem, the issue with that is, first of all, they have a task force of almost 100 police officers working that case, and all indications are it's a serial killer working that highway. I've heard some stories from some people up there that they have some pretty good leads on that, and they're being very cautious about the execution and how they're handling it. But I have no doubt that sometime in the future they're going to arrest somebody or two people for those cases. Talking about the Highway of Tears. Now, the First Nations issue and same with Native American tribal issues, there's a huge problem there with drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and reporting. And sometimes it's very difficult to weave your way through facts and fiction and find out exactly what is going on there. But they do have major issues there.
Thanks for the call. We're going to try Jason in Missouri. Good morning, Jason. You're on with Dave Paulides.
Hi. Good morning, George. Good morning, David. I called and talked to David about a year ago on George Norrie's show, and but I forgot to tell. I don't know if David remembers or not. I had the same experience that David had in the woods, where I'd gotten lost. I was deer hunting, and I got like 10 miles deep in the woods, and I was in Ironton, Missouri. And the woods are really thick back there. And the woods went dead, just like David had reported what would happen to him. And I felt something watching me. And the best way I can describe it is like if anybody's ever been through a tornado, you know that drop in the temperature that you feel? That's what it felt like. And I started walking. As I was walking, I sensed something was watching me, like it was mimicking my steps. So I thought, well, I'll take a step and act like I'm going to step through and see if whatever's following me takes a step. And I didn't step down, and I heard the crunch. And I turned around, and nothing was there. Anyway, what I seen in the woods that night was, it was really crazy. It was, I seen some garden gnomes, some concrete garden gnomes 10 miles out in the woods, and I was wanting to see if David had ever seen any strange occurrences at a scene like that.
Nope, never.
It was really, I know that sounds crazy. These garden gnomes were 10 miles out in the woods, and it was, I know this sounds completely crazy, but, you know, I remember I sat down with my back up against a big tree, because I was just, you know, it really had me scared. You know, I had that feeling like, I don't know, like something wanted to hurt me. And I waited out probably for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then the forest come back to life, animals started going around again, and then I made a dart as fast as I could up the mountain, and I was listening for a highway, and I got out of there. But yeah, it was really crazy.
Jason, you should probably write to David, email him. We've got the links on our website. I think he'd probably like to hear more about it. Thanks for sharing your story with us. We're going to try to talk to Thomas in La Jolla. Hi, Thomas.
Thank you, George, for taking my call. And
Sure.
David Paulides, you do great research. My question for you, Mr. Paulides, is have you ever spoken to Native American tribal elders or tribal shamans or even Native American trackers who participate in the search for missing people in the wilderness. It seems like the Native Americans would have very interesting things to say about disappearances in the wilderness.
Yes to all of it, except the guys that actually do the tracking. Those people are harder and harder to find every year. And 50 years ago, they were pretty predominant. Now they're hard to find. But I've spent a lot of time talking to elders and living in a tribal environment for many years. So yeah, I have.
Said anything interesting?
Well, no, nothing more interesting than what I've documented so far. Same sort of things, just a different location.
Dave, do they have disappearances? Do they have tribal traditions where these kinds of things happen to them, vanishings that go way back?
There was a story that Harvey Pratt told me. Harvey Pratt's a Native American chief and he's an agent for Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation, but he told me that when he was a small kid, they used to sit around a campfire and said, no, you don't leave the light of the campfire at night. And he said there was always an overarching statement that, there are bad people out there. And he goes, we'd be in the middle of nowhere and said, hey, don't leave the light of the campfire. And he said, now with what I know today, it seems like there was some other underlying reason that they emphasize that over and over.
We'll try Gordon in Florida. Good morning, Gordon.
George, David, thank you for taking my call. With regard to what you said earlier, there were 5 days that you say elapsed between the time that he could have started walking and they started looking for him. And I know that it was cold weather, but it wasn't as cold earlier on. And I believe I could have walked 15 miles if I'd been young, healthy, had a lot of clothing on, and just really tried. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Now, I'm not saying that was definitely possible, but I think it was possible.
With no shoes?
With no shoes? Well, I mean, yeah. Zola Budd, who is an Olympic runner, is a distance runner, and she runs barefoot. And she almost beat Mary Decker Tab before she got tripped up. And she runs barefoot. Now, granted, she doesn't run in the cold, but you see where I'm going with this, that it's possible he could have gotten a long distance before the weather got really cold. But I'm not saying he could have. I just say that I think he could. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Gordon.
Sure.
Well, I think it's contrary to what search and rescue thought. It's contrary to what the sheriff thought. It's contrary kind of to what we've talked about tonight. I mean, of course there's people out there that have gotten their feet acclimated to the outdoors and could do things on their feet that people that wear shoes all the time couldn't. And there was never any note that he was someone that didn't wear shoes. And from all the indications from search and rescue and the incident archives that I found, it was everyone's opinion that he had to have started when it started to snow. And he didn't leave earlier. Now, I mean, could be wrong about that, but that's what I read into what they stated.
Well, I guess, again, 15 aerial miles is not the same as 15 miles walking on the ground.
Oh, for sure.
West of the Rockies, Eric in Long Beach. Hi, Eric.
Hey, how's it going, guys?
All right.
What you guys are describing tonight, especially the woman saying she's seen something that looked like it was wrapped in saran wrap, that's something that I've seen in the urban city back in the early 90s. And I was sitting in a car with an older friend of mine, and I looked up, and I looked at a tree, and it looked distorted, in the tree, and my friend was looking at it too. And I told my friend, I said, are you seeing what I'm seeing? And he said, I'm looking at the one on the left. And then I realized there was 2 of them. And when they focused their vision on us, they had the most bloodshot, red, glowing type eyes. But one thing I noticed is they noticed us, and it's almost like I can understand what they were saying to each other, and they were in amazement that we were actually able to see them. So long story short, we darted out of there as fast as we could. I mean, it was just, our reaction. We were scared, out of our mind. But I talked to somebody a couple years later, an older guy in the neighborhood, about it, and he said, "Oh, you guys seen the tree people?" So a lot of people for years have been seeing those people around here. They don't have no shape to them, and usually people people have seen them. People in the neighborhood would disappear around that time, is when those things would show up in the neighborhood. And
Eric, we're about out of time. I'm going to let Dave respond, but maybe you should also write to him at the links we have. Dave, a reaction to that?
Sounds interesting. I really don't have any other response.
Maybe that's your next book project, is the tree people.
Yeah.
Thanks for hanging with us tonight, David, and I recommend that people check out this book. The Bruce Maccabee story alone is worth digging into and seeing that photo. It's a good work again, and I think it feels like you're inching closer to some answers, if that's even possible. Are you still encouraged that it is a solvable mystery?
Boy, that's $1 million question, George. I don't know. I mean, there's so many different twists and turns to this road, it's hard to say.
Well, I hope people will check out this book. If you haven't read the earlier ones, check those out as well. We've got the links on our website, thanks to our callers there. In a moment, Ben Paulides, who's been working with David on the movie version of Missing 411, will be joining us to talk about where the film stands and how the production is going. And a lot of the folks who are listening tonight likely contributed to the production of that movie. So we'll be right back with more Coast to Coast AM. The song is called Back on the Map. It's Casey Musgraves, who she's carved out her own spot on the map. Musically has her own niche. No one else quite like her in popular music these days. If you don't know her, you should check it out. Several weeks ago, I was given a sneak preview of Missing 411, the movie. It's a documentary film being produced to tell the stories that we've been talking about tonight and others, the stories of people who've lost loved ones, folks who have vanished, and the story, the investigation that Dave Paulides started some years ago. The film is now edited, I'm told. It's being entered in some prestigious festivals. The man who directed it is Ben Paulides, David's son, and he's going to join me in just a minute to talk about the film, where it is, and how folks can see it. And then we'll take your calls and questions about the subject matter as well. Stick around for our final hour of Coast to Coast. Missing 411, the movie, has been edited, produced. It's ready to be seen at a couple of festivals. Its director is Ben Paulides. Welcome him to the program for the first time. Ben, good to have you here.
Hey, George. Thanks for having me on. It's really great to finally be on the show.
So give us sort of the status report. A lot of the folks who are listening tonight probably helped with the crowdsource funding of the project. Where did things stand? How do you like it?
Yeah, so the film is completed. We've shown it to a select few people, you being one of them. And so far, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. I think I actually co-directed it with Michael DeGrazier, who you met when we all met in Las Vegas. And he also co-edited it. And between him and I think we have something like 100,000 hours invested just in this film. So it's been a super long journey. We're thrilled that we're nearing the finish line and we can get this out to everybody, because it's something that we're so proud of. I mean, to carry on the work that my dad has done and get that kind of opportunity. I mean, we're really excited to get it out there.
So spill some family secrets. Did you want to work on this? Did you ask your father, hey, can I get in on it? Or did he ask you?
No, yeah, I actually had to sell him on my ability, because I came straight out of undergrad, and I knew I wanted to do film, and he was, he had been approached by several other groups of people who were going to take the material and kind of do something with it that wasn't maybe ethical or moral. And we both knew that it needed to be a film that told the truth, that stayed true to the families, that stayed true to the facts, especially. And so when I proposed this plan for the film, and told him that I would bring in Michael, who had a ton of experience, to be co-director. I would produce. He was pretty impressed, and luckily we raised all the money on Kickstarter and made a really great Kickstarter video, and the support's been just absolutely overwhelming.
Give me your take on it from inside the family, as your dad has gone down this very strange path. When you first start reading these books, what are you thinking? Has Dad gone around the bend, or is this really interesting? Were you hooked right off the bat, or what?
No, I mean, I've always been super intrigued by his work. I don't think I fully appreciated it until I was a bit older and I had some kind of life experience for myself, because, I think there's an old saying that, one murder is a tragedy, but 6 million's a statistic, and we tried to, in the documentary, give a human face to the work, because, I mean, you can read and you can kind of get lost in the statistics, but it was really important. And, my dad was a huge supporter of this the whole time. Let's tell a human story. So that's what always attracted me to the material, was the emotional core, and just like these families that are living without any closure whatsoever. And, people debate what happened to them, but the fact of the matter is they're gone and there's no explanation. So
I had the same reaction, seeing that, I've done a lot of interviews with your father, and we've covered all of his books on this program, and it almost is mind-numbing to some degree. You read case after case. Occasionally there's a photograph that accompanies a case file or a report that puts a face on it, but nothing like the power of video and film to tell a story and to personalize it. And that's what moved me, is that these are real people who have experienced an incredible loss and have faced an indescribable mystery that they can't figure out. That's what I liked about it.
Well, thanks, George. Yeah, I mean, that was our aim. And there's one case in particular where this family, Dior Kuntz, went missing in Ledore, just outside Ledore, Idaho, last year in July. So this time in 2015. And for the longest time, his parents were vilified in the media. And when we went up there and met with the family and heard about the story of little Dior going missing, which we talked about in the film, it was kind of disheartening to see this family kind of shy away from wanting to talk about their son in the media, because every time they went out, it was just an onslaught of out and out lies by a lot of these Facebook paparazzi people. And so in a sense, the documentary almost plays a dual purpose, because it shows how quickly people use misinformation to target some of these family members, which is insane, and then also the strange disappearances of these children. So you have kind of the social context, and then what I like to say, subcultural context.
Yeah, when you have a child that disappears, it's the family that's the main suspect, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what you hear every time, and there's, in a lot of cases, that's what these professionals are trained to look for, and in many cases, it turns out, unfortunately, to be true that it is a family member. But in so many of these other cases where the child is found vast distances away, the parent wasn't even there at the time and is accounted for. I mean, there's just, and you see this time and time again. So it's, I mean, the wilderness always has had this mystique to me, and to actually go out there and be in a spot where this person was last seen, and you're standing there and the wind stops blowing, it is very surreal. And we try to capture that so the audience can kind of understand how we felt as filmmakers.
What kind of level of cooperation did you get from government folks, Park Service, Department of Interior? I know, we've talked about the sensitivities there, and there was some resistance to cough up information. What about for the film?
Right. So we did get an interview with a top administrative official who was actually appointed by Obama. And we urge you to check out the movie when it comes out, because what he says is kind of boggling. And I mean, you saw. So we were able to kind of maneuver our way to get an interview. We said it was about national parks, and the documentary has a large section about national parks, and that was what we kind of said. So, but then, he wasn't in the National Park Service, so we had to try to pursue the Park Service, and that's, it's a big part of this film because we had people going on talking about how they'd like to see more search and rescue. They'd like to see the Park Service pull in outside operations earlier. You have search and rescue officials who talk about finding children with their clothes off. It's kind of somebody described it as a documentary horror movie because it's almost uncomprehendable to think what could be happening.
Well, we're going to come back to that. The person you're talking about interviewing was the Secretary of the Interior, and yeah, he was given that job by Obama. It was kind of a contentious interview that will let people see for themselves. What about other levels of cooperation, lower down the food chain, rangers, folks who had worked at these agencies? You had some people who at least were willing to appear on camera?
Right, and what I always kind of tell people is the documentary isn't written until it's edited. And a documentary needs to tell a story. And the story was definitely about these kids. And when we approached law enforcement officials, private investigators, they were very willing to get on there and kind of talk about finding these children because that's foremost the important thing in everybody's mind and what everybody wants to see. So we did get a chance to interview a few park rangers. Most of them went off camera, but you look at maybe 10 cases initially when you're filming, and it boils down to 4 at the end because you don't get enough leads, and because that's what we're trying to be out there doing is kind of reporting on this stuff, and I think the Dior Kuntz case, when we had the sheriff and the private investigator of the case, as well as all the suspects and persons of interest in the entire case, we got full access to all of them. So I think people are it's going to be pretty enlightening.
What's heartbreaking is the parents of kids who disappear, who blame themselves. You can see it as they're struggling to even tell the story. They're not only chastised and suspected by their neighbors and friends, but they're racked by guilt. If I had only done something different, it must be my fault. They blame themselves, don't they?
Yeah, and I really don't think anybody can pass judgment on people like that until it has happened to them. And unfortunately, when you have with the rise of social media, you get so many great things. I mean, interconnectedness, you can start a revolution now politically. It's great things, but at the same time, it can really tear down people and other good causes. So, we saw on the Dior Kuntz case, these parents, people were quick to judge. And that's how we got the interview with them, is we wanted to say, we said, hey, we want to tell the story, and we want to show people who you really are and what really happened to your son and all the facts involved. And I think it's going to, little Dior was featured on the cover of People magazine 3 weeks ago. And this is something that the public, I think, feels very strongly about. And we wanted to definitely tell it in the right context, in the right manner. So in order to kind of exonerate them, in a sense, in the public's viewing.
You had a little bit of star power in there, a face that a lot of our viewers would know. Tell me who that was and what contributions he made. Yeah,
so I know my dad and Les Stroud has collaborated a bit in the past on a few different projects, given their areas of expertise. Les Stroud, Survivor Man, longest running cable television show from Discovery Channel, talks extensively in the documentary about one of our missing cases and how unlikely / impossible it would be for one of these children to go the distance they do. And I think when you see the terrain and you see, Survivor Man up there, you're like, well, I don't know what else I need to be convinced of, because he's always been legit. He's filmed all his own stuff. He's kind of like an all fact, no BS kind of guy, and he was super helpful and he continues to want to help. So we were very lucky and happy to have him be involved.
Does he have a theory? And the same question to you. Your father is notorious for going nowhere near giving an answer or saying what he suspects is going on. Do you, even if you can't answer, do you have a theory in mind that explains it?
Well, you know what? I think my dad doesn't want to give a theory because there is no suitable theory that can be given. I mean, right now there is not enough evidence to really understand what is going on. And until that happens, I think it'd be foolish to really jump to a conclusion. There's things that we don't fully understand about the world we live in. I mean, there's so many things we don't even know that we don't know. So why would we ever kind of jump to that and then say, well, this is absolutely happening to these children?
Well, I agree with that. I mean, you don't know the answer to who or why. You do know some of the what's going on. It's like a harvest. It's like a reaping or a predatory behavior on the part of something. Is that going too far?
Well, it's tough to say predatorial, and the only reason I say that is because in very
Hello? We're going to hold on a second here for Ben. We've got a lot of callers on the line, and maybe we'll try. There's a caller from Melbourne, Australia. I was going to open up the phone lines in a moment. What we were going to get into in a second was about the film itself. It's been entered in a couple of festivals. I think one is Telluride. They won't know for a little bit whether or not it's accepted. What I don't know the answer to is whether when the public will be able to see the film and what venue they will use to distribute it. So when we get Ben back on the phone, maybe he can tell us. In the meantime, we'll just go to the phones and start taking some calls from our listeners. There's Paul in Melbourne, Australia. Hi, Paul. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Hi, how you doing? What's on your mind?
You listening?
You
David's
called us.
gone off
Would
the
you
air,
like to talk about this?
Yeah, David's gone off the air, hasn't he?
David has been off the air. This is Ben is his son. We're trying to get him back on, but if you want to just kind of lead into what you wanted to talk about, we'll have him back in a second. What's on your mind?
Yeah. Are you guys familiar? You're not familiar with Black Mountain in Queensland, are you?
I'm not, but why don't you share it with us? Hello?
Yep. Are you guys familiar with the TV show The Extraordinary, or?
I am not. Did you have a story you want to share with us about something that happened down there?
Yeah.
I'll tell you what. You can call back, and we'll talk about it another time. Ben, if you're back, can you tell us about the festivals that you've entered the film in and where things stand, and then when the general public can start to see it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've only entered into a few festivals right now. A few of the top ones. I don't want to say which ones at this point because I don't want to over publicize the thing until we know exactly which ones we get into. But we're hoping to have this film out sometime in probably Q4 of this year or Q1 of next year. And that's just dependent on what festivals we get into. But the independent film route, in order to kind of rise the ranks, takes a longer process than we had originally anticipated. But we're gonna get it out there as quickly as we can because we think it's important.
What's the platform for the public to see it, though? In theaters or on video or on demand or what?
We're probably going to aim for a streaming service or a network. There's a lot of documentary kind of distributors out there, and we're just trying to figure out the right one who's going to let us show what we edited and then put it out there for public consumption. So that's kind of TBD at this point.
And I know that the crowdfunding was the way you raised the money for it. Did you have enough? I guess it's never enough.
Right. I mean, in filmmaking, you always plan for the worst and hope for the best. But I mean, we had a lot of money, and so many of the people that worked on the project took reduced rates or didn't get paid at all, just to see this thing get through. And the people I've shown it to say that it looks more like $1 million documentary than just a $100,000 documentary. So we're pretty happy with the production value and kind of what the team was able to put together, you know. And like I said before, Michael DeGrazier, my co-director and editor, he did a phenomenal job.
All right. We're talking with Ben Paulides. When we come back, we open up the phone lines with your questions about Missing 411, the movie, or whatever else you got on your mind. Stick with us. Patsy Cline takes us into the break. From 1964, that's the Beatles, I'll Be Back. We're talking with Ben Paulides, the co-director of the Missing 411 movie. He is ready to take your questions and comments both about the movie and about the work he's done with his father. So far, we haven't got him to spill any family secrets, but we'll keep trying. The phones are pretty full, and we'll get to as many of your calls and comments and questions as we can in our final segment of Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to our final segment this evening. Ben Paulides is my guest. We go to the phones. First-time caller, Cameron in Downey, California. Hi, Cameron. Welcome to the program. Hello, Cameron.
Hello. Hi.
Hi. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I actually had a question for Dave, but since he's not on the air, I'll just ask you guys anyways. So I've been following you guys for quite a while since you've been doing the Missing 411, and there's plenty of trends that are pretty evident throughout all his books. But I'm just wondering, has there ever been any thought put into maybe testing some of the DNA and seeing if there's any similarities with genetics? That's something, I mean, if people are getting abducted or they're going missing, I don't want to draw any conclusions in respect to Dave, but perhaps that's something that's been overlooked. There might be a genetic similarities between the people who are missing, and
interesting
maybe
point.
That's why they're being abducted.
Ben, any discussion about genetic similarities or some kind of DNA link?
That's an interesting point he brings up. I don't know. I think it's interesting that there's a lot of crippled and handicapped children that go missing, and one could argue that maybe that's due to their condition, but maybe they're being targeted because of their genetics. I'm not one to speculate either way, but I think it's an interesting theory and maybe an avenue that should be pursued.
Appreciate the idea, Cameron. That's an interesting thought. Maybe we'll find out what Dave has to say about that. West of the Rockies, Chris in Redding, California. Hi, Chris.
Hi, I'm a private security guard here at Whiskeytown National Park Service, and I'm standing out here, and I just wanted to let the folks know that, we have a campground here with 90-plus people. We constantly have issues here of physical violence, people stealing, people cutting up other people's camping gear. I am the only one out here. And the rangers, I had an incident where I had to call the rangers. There was an individual out here driving drunk with his child, trying to unload and load his boat, and the rangers would not show up. And what's interesting is when I call their dispatch, it goes all the way to the Sequoia National Park, or up here at Whiskeytown. It's hundreds of miles away. To make a long story short, these rangers kind of bullied me, and they didn't want me talking to the California Highway Patrol that finally showed up. And I thanked them. I said, these rangers will refuse to come out after 9 o'clock, and it's a 2-hour wait. So, in other words, there's 90 people here. I have a flashlight. That's it. If anyone wanted to hurt these people, attack these people, kidnap these people, there's really nothing I can do, and no one's going to come out here for 2 solid hours. Another interesting thing I wanted to let you folks know is I was also at one time a firefighter engineer here at Whiskeytown National Park Service in the 90s. And one of the rangers showed me, there's 2 things that go on in this park. A lot of times people like to commit suicide here for some reason because they see it as such a beautiful spot. And he also showed me some caves, and it took back to these mines. And there's devil worship, red and black candle wax, red and black writing all over the walls. There was a body found here at Kennedy Memorial Drive. One of the concessionaires had a dead cat struck to their trailer. There's a lot of crazy things that go on here, and Whiskeytown is running out of money. There's a fire. I'm standing right next to the fire station here. There's no one in this fire station. So if anyone comes down screaming out of that camp, there's no one here to help them when fire.
Let me interrupt you for a second, Chris. You know, I feel for the folks who work on public lands, National Park Service, BLM, the U.S. Forest Service. There's not enough money to go around, millions and millions of acres, and I can see that they're stretched pretty thin. I guess what I would ask you, the topic that we're on tonight about missing 411, have you encountered anything like that, heard stories like that in your neck of the woods?
Well, you know, this is more of a preventative thing. You know, this is a tragedy here at this campground is waiting to happen. They have these solar lights that come on at night. 95% of them don't work. It's pitch black here.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. I appreciate the input. We're just going to try to keep it on the subject of the missing folks. But thank you for calling and sharing with us the difficulties that you're facing there at that national park. We're going to go east of the Rockies, Preston in Daytona Beach. Hi, Preston.
Hey, George. It's good talking to you again. Thanks for taking my call.
What's on your mind?
Well, you know, I always like to put in a military spin on things because, you know, I'm in the military, and I was actually hoping to talk to David, but I'd be glad to talk to Ben too. And you know, it's funny you talk about these national parks. You know, so many of them are covered by military airspace for training purposes only. You know, what's to say that they're not doing training out there where no one's looking? You know, with, you know, some of these things like this pixelation thing that we were talking about earlier. You know, holograms. I mean, we've already got those with kid Cracker Jack toys. You know, do you guys feel like maybe that's a perfect place to test out new equipment instead of where everyone's watching on a military base?
Ben, I can't remember if you touch on the possibility that it's a human activity or not in the film, but have you ever talked about that with your dad?
Well, like in the film, we looked at all the parents and people who were involved, but, you know, obviously that's a far cry from military. I haven't really talked to him much. I mean, I think in some of the instances there could be some sort of military intervention if you're way out there in the middle of nowhere, but I personally never heard anything.
And Preston, I would point out that these cases, the disappearances have been going on for at least a century. You know, for a lot longer than we would have had the technology to do something like that. But as we learned in the show about the book Camellia, there are a lot of folks working on that. So I think it can't be tossed out entirely. Thanks for the call. We're going to go to the wild card line. Mary in Phoenix. Hi, Mary.
Thank you for taking my call. Ben, really excited about the film. I wondered if you or your father had any kind of theory about this predator or whatever, why it seems to target the bow hunters, that maybe it has something to do with the sound frequency or electromagnetic something, that, the gun hunters don't get targeted as much or something because it attracts more attention, or because it disperses the sound, that maybe they work along those waves, or I don't know what. But I was just curious, why bow hunters seem to be more, victims, that if there was any theories you guys had about that.
I mean, yeah, those are all interesting theories. I'm personally unfamiliar with any of that, any of those, but maybe, I could see it, maybe something like that happening, some sort of frequency or noise, or I think, but my dad would have been the good one to ask that for sure.
So you've been working on the film as he's been working on the book about hunters.
Right. I know. I've only talked to him in passing, actually, about his latest book, because we've been working so hard on this documentary trying to get it out there. But I know that from what I've read, the excerpts he sent me, it's, I think it might be some of his most important work, just in terms of kind of what's systematically happening out there.
Yeah, Mary, I would just have to guess that his answer would be, we really don't know. Don't know why anyone is targeted for sure. But it is weird that the percentage of bow hunters is higher than the percentage of hunters who are carrying firearms. Thanks for the call. We're going to go to Keith in Wisconsin. Hi, Keith.
Yeah, as far as bow hunters, part of the reason why they might get targeted is in most states, the bow season is a lot longer. These guys are more religious about getting to their bow stands.
Oh.
Also, too, you got that guy you were talking about in the Crazy Mountain, or your dad was talking about in the Crazy Mountains, where they found his boots and they found his gear, found his bow and such. He probably had a second pair of shoes, and he was probably going into lost delirium, and he was yard sailing his gear because he thought it was weighing him down. But as far as this goes, have you ever thought about the angle of possibility of Sasquatch kidnappings? I had heard of a couple cases up in Saskatchewan where guys had gone out on their canoes and had gotten grabbed. And these were guys. These were, guys going out hunting, and they'd be gone for 2 or 3 days, and they would find themselves getting grabbed up in the middle of the night by Sasquatches.
Ben, in the course of putting the film together, did you have anybody raise the idea that maybe Bigfoot is doing abductions or is responsible for some of these people disappearing?
If we heard anything, it was only secondhand. None of the people we interviewed said that to us. I've heard of stories, I think, of eyewitness accounts maybe of things like that happening, but I've never heard from anybody firsthand about that, no.
I know a lot of people have emailed the program here, Coast to Coast, with that suggestion, in part because your father, when he first appeared on the show, it was to talk about Bigfoot, the first 2 books that he wrote about Sasquatch research and Native Americans, and I think people were trying to put 2 and 2 together, suggesting that he secretly suspected that Bigfoot was behind it. I think he would probably say he does not believe that to be the case, but is maintaining an open mind. We're going to try Harry in Austin, Texas. Hi, Harry.
Hi, George.
Good morning.
I got a question. It was for David, but maybe Ben would know. If y'all have ever sought the help of psychic detectives who help many law enforcement agencies around the United States find missing people, both dead and alive, and sometimes they'll find them up to 20 years after they were buried out in the middle of nowhere.
Ben, did you ever think about talking to psychics about helping with the searches, or have any of the law enforcement folks who you interviewed or talked to for the film, have they resorted to that?
So that, I think he broke up there a little bit, but I think I got the gist of it. So I haven't heard of any of that psychic, and I wish you could have asked my dad about that, because I'm certain he would have an answer for you. But all I can say is that that's an interesting angle for sure.
We'll try east of the Rockies. Tom in the Bronx. Good morning, Tom.
Warriors. I like to say this. When there were people jumping off the trade centers because of the fires and explosions, a lot of these individuals never made it to the ground. They actually disintegrated in the air. The same held true for the bathrooms that were falling down to the ground. They turned into literal dust. I wonder if there are government projects, sinister government projects that are actually, in some cases, actually disintegrating some people, maybe using some kind of very sadistic equipment, maybe for war use eventually or whatever. I mean, I know it sounds paranoid for me to say that.
No, I think it's something that maybe should be looked at. It's interesting. Beyond that, I don't know. It sounds like it's something of science fiction, but a lot of this stuff kind of does.
Yeah, and again, a lot of these disappearances happened a long time ago, 80, 90, 100 years ago. So there was certainly not that kind of technology back when those happened. It might explain some kind of cases now, although I'd wonder how you make the body disappear and leave the clothing and the boots. Interesting idea, Tom. Thank you. We're going to try Lily in northern Minnesota on the wild card line. Hi, Lily.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
A couple of points. The map that Mr. Paulides shows on the clusters in the United States. When I saw that, it really struck me that there's a whole section right down the middle, and particularly in the Dakotas, where it doesn't look like there are any markings. And I just was wondering if anybody's been looking into the areas that nothing is happening that might give a clue as to, why those areas are different, might point you in the direction of looking at, why it's happening in other places. And the second point is, with the guys bringing up Bigfoot, I've been listening to Dogman stories and Bigfoot stories on YouTube from a couple of different channels, and almost all of them say the same thing, that when right before they had some kind of encounter, particularly with Dogman, is everything went silent in the woods. From insects to birds to any other animals. And you mentioned that happened with the lady that was bow hunting. And I think that might be a major clue in this. And thank you for what you guys are doing and looking into this. And just also wanted to say how much I appreciate George Knapp and the bumper music and his great way of interviewing. Thank you.
Thanks, Lily. I guess it would be tough, kind of a challenge for your team, Ben, your father, and you to look into areas where stuff is not happening, since you have you're stretched pretty thin looking at the areas where it is happening. But that's an interesting idea, why it happens in some places and not others. I don't think you have an answer.
No, I think, the clusters are somewhat of a mystery outside of, the national park ones. But, thanks a lot for the support, Lily.
The idea about the Dogman, that's pretty interesting. We've had a couple of shows about that. I had not heard that there is a similar phenomena where the woods get quiet when these things appear. But, we don't know what the answer to this thing is, so it might have many faces. It might look like a chameleon, kind of a predator to some people and a Dogman to another. Nobody has an answer for it. Try to get one more quick call in. West of the Rockies, Kevin. Better make it a quick call, Kevin.
Yeah, I work in search and rescue. I have an air scent dog and a cadaver dog both. And I've been on many searches, and there's usually, good reasons why these people disappear. Every once in a while, you just have no clues. But the thing I was curious about in the production of your film is, are you using any of the training techniques that we use to train these dogs?
We actually aren't out there searching. We're just interviewing the families and law enforcement and officials to understand what happened to these kids or what could have happened. Because we're interviewing people across multiple decades. We're not actively out there searching, but we did interview two ladies in search and rescue with their dogs, and they talked about one of the searches they were on and the techniques they used to find these children. So, to your point, we try to get all perspectives, including search and rescue and everything they do.
And in general, Ben, is there a level of cooperation with search and rescue folks, or do they look at you as sort of interlopers who don't understand what they do?
Yeah, everybody we interviewed who was involved in search and rescue, from a former sheriff of Klamath County to these two ladies who their whole job is to go out there and search for missing people. Everybody was really cooperative because they all had experience with these kind of strange phenomena. So, and strange things do happen in the wilderness. It's kind of an untapped mysterium of things in there. So, from my experience, to answer your question, yes.
So if the film will come out, the public can see it beginning of the year, somewhere around there, and you're entering it in festivals. If it goes as well as you hope it goes, is there another one in the works, or you think it could become a series of films as well as books?
I would like to see it become a series. Hopefully, after we sell it, somebody, it does well, and we can, make it into a broader, kind of a series maybe, or something of the sort, because the public needs to know what's going on. So, yeah, I would love to see it get to that point.
There's certainly a lot of material to work with. It could be a series on TV that could go on for a long time. Ben Paulides, thanks very much. Look forward to having you back after the film is out and the public can get a look at it. Thanks. Thanks also to Dave Paulides, of course. The Missing 411 Hunters Unexplained Disappearances is the new book. We have links on our website. And I want to say thanks to my colleagues there who helped put on tonight's program, Jeff DeRay, Donna Walker, Dan Galante, our webmaster Lex, and producer Chris Boros. I'm George Knapp. Good night, everyone.